Welcome back to the quiet apothecary. Settle in wherever you happen to be tonight. Let your breath slow of its own accord. Let your shoulders come down from wherever the day has left them, and let the room around you grow a little softer and a little further away. There is nothing here that asks anything of you, and nowhere at all that you need to be. Tonight we do not go down to the cottage garden by its sagging wooden gate, nor into the apothecary shop on the high street with its rows of labelled jars and its brass scales. We climb instead a long gravel drive up between old limes toward a low grey manor house standing quietly among its fields. And we go in, not by the great door, but by a small one at the quiet end of the house, into a room most visitors never saw and were never meant to see. The stillroom, the place where the lady of the house kept the whole family's medicine, written out in a book in her own mother's hand. This is the story of that book and of the room, and above all of the wide, unhurried network of women who filled it, one traded receipt at a time. For the lady of a Tudor or Stuart manor was, more often than we now remember, the first physician her household ever saw, and behind her stood her mother and her grandmother and a whole quiet web of sisters and cousins and neighbours, all of them writing to one another, copying one another, mending one another's households across the length of the country. We will move through it slowly, in gentle chapters, the way she herself might have moved through her shelves on a winter evening, taking down one jar at a time. There is no need to remember any of this. Let your attention drift in and out as it pleases. We have a long, slow night ahead of us, and none of it will mind in the least. If you fall asleep somewhere in the middle and never learn how it ends until some other evening, or never at all, let us begin with the woman herself. In a great many manor houses across England, from the last years of the old Queen through the long reign of the Stuarts and beyond, the first person a sick body turned to was not a physician at all, and not the apothecary in the market town, but the lady of the house. When a scullery maid scalded her wrist at the great copper, when a groom took a fever, when the steward's chest grew tight in the damp of February, when one of the lady's own children woke crying in the night with an aching ear, it was to her rooms that word was sent, and from her hands that the first remedy came. She was, in the plain understanding of everyone who lived under that long, tiled roof, the household's own healer, and she had been raised from girlhood to be exactly that. It is worth pausing on how ordinary this was, and how little remarked upon at the time. We are used, now, to thinking of medicine as something that happens elsewhere, in the hands of trained strangers, in rooms set aside for it. In the world of the manor house it happened at home, in the family, as one more branch of the great tangled business of keeping a large household alive and fed and clothed through the turning year. The lady who ran the dairy and the brew house and the linen presses, who kept the accounts and ordered the salting of the winter meat, kept also the medicine of the house, and thought no more of it, most days, than she thought of any of her other duties. It was simply part of what it meant to be the mistress of a house. The books of the age said so plainly. The manuals written to instruct young gentlewomen in the running of a household set out physic and cookery side by side, as two branches of the same skill. Gervase Markham, writing his much-copied book on the complete Englishwoman in the early 1600s, put the healing of the sick almost first among the virtues a good housewife ought to possess. Before ever he came to her baking, and her brewing, and her care of wool and flax. To know how to preserve the health of her family, and to restore it when it faltered, was in his telling not an accomplishment but a duty, and a woman who could not do it was thought to have failed at something near the very centre of her calling. Part of the reason lay simply in distance and in cost. A physician, a man with a university degree in the learned medicine of the old authorities, was a rare and expensive creature, found in the greater towns and cities, and summoned out to a country house only for the gravest illness, and often too late to do more than confirm what everyone already feared. His fee was silver, and a good deal of it, and the journey out to a remote manor might take him the better part of a day in each direction. The apothecary, who compounded and sold the drugs the physician prescribed, was nearer but still a creature of the town. Between the ordinary small sicknesses of daily life and that distant, costly world of professional medicine stood the lady of the house, near at hand, known and trusted, and asking no fee at all. And there was more to it than convenience. The care of the household's health was understood, in the religious language of the age, as a kind of charity, one of the good works by which a Christian gentlewoman showed the quality of her soul. To tend the sick under one's own roof, and the sick poor beyond one's gate, was counted among the plain duties laid upon those whom God had placed in comfort and authority. A lady who dosed her feverish dairymaid with a cordial water she had distilled with her own hands was not only being practical. She was, in her own understanding and that of her neighbours, doing something quietly virtuous, discharging an obligation that came with her place in the world. The godlier sort of gentlewoman, in particular, wrote of her physic almost in the same breath as her prayers, as though the tending of a sick body and the tending of a soul were two motions of the same charitable hand. Her charge, when you counted it up, was a large one. A working manor might hold a great many souls beneath its roofs and within its walls, the family itself, and above them and below them a whole descending order of people, the steward and the gentlewomen who waited on the lady, the cook and the kitchen servants, the dairymaids and the laundresses, the grooms and the stable boys, the gardeners, the shepherds out at the far folds, the scullery boy who slept by the kitchen fire. All of them, when they sickened, were in some measure her responsibility, and all of them, from the highest to the very lowest, might in the same week pass through her still-room door with some small trouble of the body for her to answer. It was a kind of authority, this, though it was rarely named as one, the quiet governing of the health of 100 people, held in the hands of a woman who would never have thought to call herself a governor of anything. The picture the old books give us of how she understood the body is worth a moment, for it shaped everything she did. She had inherited, along with her receipts, the long tradition of the four humours, the old belief that health lay in the balance of blood and phlegm and the two biles, and that sickness was a falling out of that balance, a body grown too hot or too cold, too dry or too moist. A cough was a matter of cold and damp settled on the chest, to be answered with warming, drying things. A fever was an excess of heat, to be cooled and drawn off. She did not need to reason it out afresh each time, for the reasoning was folded already into her remedies, each one carrying its own quiet logic of hot against cold and dry against wet. A whole inherited philosophy of the body worked into the plain practice of her stillroom. The old accounts and the surviving diaries let us see all this plainly enough. When we read the private papers of the gentlewomen who kept them, we find the mistress of the house dressing a servant's sore leg on a Monday and mixing a soothing draught for her own child on a Tuesday, sending a bottle of some distilled water to a sick neighbor on a Wednesday, and receiving, on a Thursday, a poor tenant's wife at the gate with a complaint she has walked 3 miles to lay before her. A Yorkshire gentlewoman named Margaret Hoby, whose diary is among the earliest known to survive from the hand of an Englishwoman, set down just such days again and again across the closing years of the 1500s. The ordinary round of her prayers and her housekeeping threaded through with the small mending of bodies, a wound dressed here, a sick child sat with there, all of it recorded in the same even, unhurried tone. It was steady, unglamorous, endless work, folded quietly into the run of her days, and she seems, from her own words, to have thought of it as nothing very much out of the way. She was not, of course, working alone or working blind. Behind every remedy she gave stood the accumulated experience of the women who had taught her, and beside her on the shelf stood the book in which all of it was written down. And it is to that book that we must turn now, for it was the true heart of the whole quiet system, the vessel into which 100 years of women's knowledge had been poured, and out of which the medicine of the house was drawn again, generation after generation. Let us turn now to the book itself. In very many of these households there was a particular book, kept in the ladies' own rooms or on the stillroom shelf, that was among the most valued of all the family's possessions, though it would have fetched little enough at any sale. It was a manuscript, written by hand, and it went in that age by the name of the receipt book, receipt being simply the older word for what we would now call a recipe. Into it went the household's whole store of practical knowledge, the recipes for its medicines and the recipes for its dishes, the way to make a cordial water and the way to raise a good pie crust, the treatment for a burn and the method for candying a root, all bound together between the same 2 covers, in no very strict order, as the needs of a house are bound together in a single life. We are inclined now to separate these things, to file cookery in one place and medicine in another, and to be a little surprised at finding them mingled. But to the woman who kept the book, there was no clear border between them at all. The same still that drew off a sweet water for the table drew off a physic water for the sickroom. The same sugar that preserved a summer fruit for a winter dessert preserved a summer flower for a winter cough. Food shaded into medicine and medicine into food along a gentle and continuous slope, and her book, mingling the 2 on every page, simply recorded the world as she actually met it. It was not unusual, turning such a book, to find a receipt for a rich baked meat sitting directly above a receipt for a plaster to draw a boil, and directly below one a way to take spots from linen, or to make an ink that would not fade. The whole of a household's practical wisdom crowded companionably onto the same brown page. The book itself, as a physical object, tells its own story to anyone who has held one of the survivors. It might be a bought volume of blank paper, stitched and bound in plain calf or vellum, or it might be a gathering of loose leaves sewn together at home and added to as the pages filled. It was very often written in several different hands, some neat and some hurried, some in the careful, upright letters of a girl newly taught to write, and some in the loosening scrawl of a very old woman. This is because the book was rarely the work of a single person. It was begun, as often as not, by one woman, added to across her whole life, and then handed on at her death to her daughter or her daughter-in-law, who carried on writing in it in her own turn, so that the finished manuscript is a kind of layered record of 2 or 3 or 4 generations of women, each leaving her own additions and corrections among those of the women before her. Here and there a later hand has struck a line through an older receipt and written beside it that it was not found to answer. A small, quiet argument across the years between a grandmother and a granddaughter who never met. Such a book was kept carefully and often kept locked. It was too useful and too long in the making to be left where a careless servant might spoil it or a damp shelf might rot it, and so it lived, as a rule, in the lady's own keeping, in a chest or a cabinet with the other precious small things of the house, brought out to be consulted, and then put away again. In the inventories drawn up at a death, when every joint stool and every pewter dish was solemnly listed and valued, such a book might be noted simply as the mistress's book of receipts, given some modest worth in shillings, its true value to the family passing entirely unrecorded, as the truest values of a house so often do. One of the best known of these to survive belonged to a gentlewoman named Elinor Fettiplace, who lived in Berkshire, and whose book bears the date of 1604 upon it. It is a working household book of exactly this kind, its receipts for cookery and its receipts for medicine set down side by side, and it has come down to us because it was kept and copied and treasured within the family long after its first owner was gone. Reading it, or reading the accounts of those who have studied it closely, one feels very near to the ordinary, daily concerns of a real woman 4 centuries dead, near to her worry over a sick child, and her pride in a particular way of preserving a quince. There were a great many such books, most of them now lost, a few of them preserved in libraries and family collections, their pages soft and brown at the edges from long handling, each one a little different, each one holding its own family's remedies and its own particular ways of making them. What went into such a book was, above all, what had been found to work, or at least what had been found to comfort. A receipt earned its place on the page by having been tried, by the woman who wrote it or by the friend who gave it to her, and having seemed to answer. Beside a great many of them, the keeper of the book would note where the receipt had come from and how well she thought of it. This one was had from my cousin such and such. This water is very good and proved. This I had of my lady the Countess, and it did my husband much ease in his last sickness. Reading these small marginal notes now, one sees the whole social life of the medicine laid bare. Every remedy carrying with it the name of the woman who vouched for it, like a chain of quiet recommendations stretching back out of sight. The word proved, written small beside a receipt, was the highest praise the book could offer, meaning simply that it had been put to the test in that house and had not been found wanting. For the book was never truly the property of one house alone. It was a node, we might say, in a much larger web, one copy among many, forever exchanging its contents with the books of other houses through the slow traffic of visits and letters. A good receipt did not stay put. It travelled from mother to daughter, from friend to friend, from one great library shelf to another, copied out afresh each time in a new hand, gathering its little train of endorsements as it went. And so the book on the stillroom shelf, private and domestic as it looks, was in truth the local end of a knowledge that spread out across the whole country and back across 100 years, held not in any one place but in the shared, overlapping memory of a great many women who mostly never met. To understand how that knowledge moved and how a girl came at last to hold it, we must follow the book backward, out of the lady's hands and into her mother's, and see how the whole of it was handed down. Let us turn now to how the knowledge came to her, and to the long, patient handing down from mother to daughter that lay behind every page of the book. A girl born into a gentle household did not learn her physic from any school, for the schools and the universities were closed to her as firmly as they were closed to the wise woman in her cottage. She learned it at home from the women of her own family, in exactly the way her mother had learned it from hers. It was part, and not the least part, of the whole long education by which a girl was made ready to run a house of her own one day. She was taught her needle and her music, her dancing and her accounts, and alongside all of these she was taught the still and the preserving pan and the medicine chest, so that by the time she came to marry, she carried in her hands and in her head a working knowledge of how to keep a household well. That she was taught to read and to write at all owed a great deal to this domestic purpose. A gentlewoman's letters were, for the most part, plainer than her brother's, untouched by the Latin and the logic of the grammar school, but she was given letters enough to keep her accounts, to read her Bible and her book of devotions, and to keep and add to the family's book of receipts. The receipt book, indeed, was one of the things a girl learned to write for. To copy a remedy neatly and correctly, to set down the weights and the order of the steps without error, was a real and useful skill, and a mother teaching her daughter to write might well have set her, as one of her first serious tasks, to copying out a favorite water or a trusted salve into the family book in her own new hand. But the deeper learning was not on the page at all. It was in the stillroom, at her mother's elbow, in the doing. A small girl stood on a stool to watch the rose petals go into the still, and was given, before very long, some small safe task of her own, the picking over of a basket of herbs, the stripping of leaves from their stalks, the slow steady stirring of a syrup that must not be allowed to catch and burn. She learned by watching and by being corrected, gently and 1,000 times over, until her own hands came to know, without being told, how a conserve should look when it was done, how a wax should feel as it cooled, how much of a bitter thing was enough, and how much was too much. This was knowledge of the body, and the senses as much as of the mind, and it could only be got by long standing near someone who already had it. There was a great deal to be got in this way, and it was got slowly, across years. She learned which herb answered which trouble, and in what form, whether as a fresh juice or a dried powder, an infusion poured over the leaf like a tea, or a decoction simmered long from the harder roots and barks. She learned the seasons of gathering, when a flower was at its best, and when a root should be lifted, much as the wise woman of the hedgerow learned them, for the Manor's own Physic garden, and the surrounding fields supplied a great part of what the stillroom used. She learned the tempers of her materials, which sugars would candy hard and which would stay soft, which waters would keep sweet for a 12-month and which must be used within the month or thrown away. And she learned, above all, the great inherited logic of hot and cold and moist and dry, so that a remedy was never merely a thing to be looked up, but a thing she could reason her own way toward when the book failed her. It was common, too, for a girl to finish this education not in her own mother's house at all, but in another. The gentry of the age often sent their daughters, for a year or several, to live in the household of some kinswoman or friend of good standing, there to be brought up in her ways, and to learn the running of a house under her eye. A girl fostered in this manner into another lady's household came to know that Lady Stillroom, as well as her own mother's, copied her best receipts into a book of her own, and formed, in the doing, a bond that might last the whole of her life. In this quiet traffic of daughters between houses, we can see one of the ways the knowledge spread and mingled, each girl carrying a little of one house's practice into another, and returning home at last with a little of that other house folded into her own. And then, in time, she married, and the whole of her learning went with her to a new house, often a considerable distance from the one she was born in. Here the handing down showed its most touching face. A mother, knowing she might see her daughter only rarely once she was gone, would set herself to write out for her the receipts she would most need, so that the girl should not go to her husband's house empty of the knowledge that would keep it well. Sometimes this took the form of a whole book, copied out fair, and given as a parting gift, a mother's entire working wisdom pressed into a daughter's hands on the eve of her wedding. Sometimes it was a sheaf of loose papers, added to over the years and sent on by carrier as new needs arose, a mother continuing to teach a married daughter across 50 miles of road by nothing but ink and paper. What the daughter carried away with her did not simply replace what she found in her new home. It joined it. The young wife came into a house that very often had a receipt book of its own already, kept by her husband's mother or grandmother, governing that particular stillroom with its own remedies and its own ways. And so the two traditions met and mingled, the bride's inherited receipts finding their place among the older ones already there, a fresh hand appearing among the faded, until the book of the house became, over a generation, a marriage of two family memories, exactly as the household itself was. It is one of the quiet pleasures of reading these old manuscripts, this sense of two women's knowledge, from two houses that never otherwise touched, lying easily side by side on the same brown page, because a marriage once brought them together. The handing down did not end at the wedding, either. A married woman remained, all her life, in close and constant touch with the mother and the sisters she had left, and a great part of what passed between them, in visit and in letter, was exactly this shared business of remedies and receipts. A daughter newly delivered of her first child wrote to her mother for the receipts her mother had used, and her mother wrote back with them, and with a great deal of tender advice besides. And it is this, the unending correspondence of women across the distances that marriage set between them, that carried the network out beyond the single family altogether, and turned a private inheritance into something very much wider. So let us turn now to the letters themselves, and to all that travelled in them. Very little travelled in the post of that age more faithfully than a good receipt. The gentlewomen of England were great writers of letters, keeping up, across the miles that separated their scattered houses, a steady traffic of news and affection and practical help, and folded into that traffic, again and again, went the plain business of medicine. A letter that began with the health of the family and the doings of the neighbourhood would turn, as naturally as breathing, to a remedy lately tried and found good, or to a request for one. Pray send me your receipt for the water you gave my sister, a woman might write, for I have great need of it here. And by the next carrier the receipt would come, copied out in a friend's or a sister's hand, to be tried in its turn and, if it answered, written into the book with that friend's name beside it. It was not only the written receipt that travelled. The remedies themselves went by the same roads, packed carefully for the journey. A gentlewoman would send to a sick friend a bottle of some distilled water she had made, a box of a candied root, a pot of a conserve, a paper of a powder. Small gifts of health carried by servant or by common carrier from one house to another. To receive such a thing was to be reminded that one was thought of and cared for across the distance, and to send it was to do a kindness that cost real time and skill to make. In the surviving letters of the age these gifts pass back and forth continually, a jar here and a bottle there. The physical tokens of a friendship carried on very largely through the shared work of keeping one another's households well. The circle in which all this moved was, first of all, the circle of kin. A woman's mother and her sisters, her aunts and her cousins and her daughters, formed the innermost ring of her correspondence, and it was among them that receipts passed most freely and most trustingly. But the circle widened out beyond blood, to take in the neighbours of her own rank, the ladies of the other manors within a day's ride, met at church and at market, and at the great occasions of the county, and it widened further still through them, so that a remedy might pass from a woman to her neighbour, and from that neighbour to her cousin 2 counties off, and so travel a great distance from where it began, gathering a fresh name at every stage of the journey. In this way a single good receipt might spread across half of England in a generation, carried entirely by the private letters of women, without ever being printed or sold or written into any public book at all. We can watch a little of this happening in the letters that do survive. When Lady Brilliana Harley wrote from her house on the Welsh border to her son away at his studies, she filled her letters with a mother's whole care for his body, sending him remedies and advice for his health along with her love, in just the tone in which she must have written to her own kinswomen. In the great bundles of family letters that come down to us from houses such as the Verneys, the same domestic medicine surfaces again and again, the sending of a receipt, the report of how a remedy had served, the anxious exchange of counsel when someone lay ill and the family was scattered and could do nothing for one another but write. These were not idle exchanges. In a world where a loved one might be a week's hard travel away and failing, a receipt sent by letter was very often the only help a woman could give, and she gave it with all the care she had. Even the learned physician was not, in the end, outside this network so much as caught up in it. When a family did call in a doctor and paid his fee and received his prescription, that prescription did not vanish once the illness had passed. It was copied into the book and passed on by letter to a sister or a friend who had a like complaint, so that the costly wisdom of the physician was quietly absorbed into the free and flowing wisdom of the women, and went on doing service in houses he had never visited and would never be paid by. A great many of the more elaborate remedies in the surviving books, the compound waters and the intricate confections, seem to have begun their lives in just this way, as something a doctor once prescribed, before the women took them up and carried them on among themselves. There was a certain pride and pleasure in it, too, that we should not overlook. To be known as the keeper of a particularly good receipt for some troublesome complaint was a small and genuine distinction, and to be asked for it was a compliment. A woman whose plague water was reckoned the best in the county, or whose salve for a green wound was sent for from 20 miles around, held a real standing among her neighbors, earned not by rank or by wealth, but by skill and by generosity, by the willingness to share what she knew. The network ran, in the end, on that generosity, on the plain understanding that knowledge freely given came back, in time, as knowledge freely received, and that a household which shared its remedies was a household that would never be without them. All of this, the inherited book and the taught skill and the received letters, converged at last upon a single place, the room where the remedies were actually made. For a receipt on a page is only a promise until some pair of hands takes it up and makes it real, and the hands of the Manor did that work in one particular room, set a little apart from the rest of the house, cool and quiet and full of the smell of drying herbs. Let us turn now to that room and to the tools she kept there. The stillroom stood, in most houses that had one, a little apart from the busy heart of the household. It was not the kitchen, with its great fires and its clamour and its constant coming and going, and it was not the hall where the family lived its public life. It was a quieter room, often on the cool north side of the house or on the ground floor near the garden, chosen for its steadiness of temperature and its distance from the smells and the smoke of the cooking. Here the air stayed even, neither baking in summer nor freezing in winter, and here the delicate work of drawing and keeping the medicines of the house could go on undisturbed, hour by patient hour, through the turning of the year. Its very name told what it was for. It was the still room, the room of the still, but it was also, in the older sense of the word, a still and quiet place, a room of storage and of steady, unhurried craft. Under its one roof two things happened. The medicines and the sweet things of the house were made here, and they were kept here, so that the room was at once a workshop and a storehouse, a place of making and a place of keeping, exactly as the receipt book that governed it was at once a book of instruction and a book of memory. Along its walls ran shelves, and on the shelves stood the vessels in which the year's work was held. There were bottles and phials of glass, some clear and some green, holding the distilled waters and the cordials. There were squat earthenware pots, glazed within, called gallipots, holding the salves and the conserves and the soft confections. There were larger jars for the dried herbs and the roots, and boxes for the powders, and small covered dishes for the things that must be kept close and dry. Every vessel, in a well-ordered room, bore its name and often its date, written on a little tag of parchment or scratched into the glaze, so that the lady could tell at a glance what she had, and how old it was, and whether it might still be trusted, or had best be thrown out and made afresh. Glass, in that age, was a precious thing, thin and easily broken and dearly bought. Much of the finest of it carried a great distance from Venice and the glass houses of the Low Countries, and a stillroom store of glass was reckoned among its real treasures. A tall clear phial for a cordial water, a shapely bottle for a rose water meant as a gift. These were things to be handled carefully and washed with care and mourned a little when they broke. Beside the glass stood humbler stuff, pewter measures and funnels, and much plain earthenware, and here and there a piece of good silver kept for the finest of the confections. For a sugared thing set out to honor a guest might be served on silver as proudly as any dish from the kitchen. The tools of the work lay ready to hand. There were mortars and their pestles, some of marble and some of brass or bell metal, for the pounding of seeds and roots and the bruising of leaves. There were fine sieves and strainers of cloth for the clearing of a syrup or the straining of a decoction. There were presses for wringing the last of a juice from a mass of herbs, and spatulas and slices for the working of a salve, and a small balance with its weights for the measuring out of the more careful remedies, where too much of a strong thing might do harm and too little do nothing. And there was, in some corner or on some hearth of its own, the means of a gentle fire, a small furnace or a chafing dish of charcoal, kept low and steady, for so much of the room's work depended on heat that was patient and mild rather than fierce. At the center of it all, when the house was grand enough to own one, stood the still itself, the instrument that gave the room its name. It was a thing of copper and of glass, a rounded body of metal set over its fire, and above it a head, sometimes called the limbeck, from which the drawn vapor passed down a long cooling neck, a coiled pipe named the worm for its serpentine turns, to fall at last, drop by patient drop, into the waiting glass receiver below. To see it working was to see something close to magic worked in plain daylight. A heap of common petals in the belly of the thing, and a clear sweet water gathering, drop by drop, in the glass beneath. But we run ahead of ourselves, for the working of the still deserves an evening's attention of its own. The room was kept, above all, clean and in order, for the work would not answer otherwise. A tainted vessel spoiled a water, a damp shelf rotted a conserve, a muddled store, where the lady could not tell one powder from another, was worse than no store at all, and might do real harm. And so cleanliness and order were not niceties here, but the very ground of the craft, and a good still room was known by the sweetness of its air, the brightness of its washed glass, and the plain legibility of its labelled shelves. The smell of such a room was one that those who had known it never forgot, the warm, dry scent of 1,000 dried flowers and herbs, of beeswax and of spice, of rose and of lavender, laid down year upon year, until it soaked into the very timbers of the place. It was, finally, the lady's own room, in a way that few other rooms of the house were. The kitchen belonged to the cook, the hall to the whole family and its guests, but the still room belonged to the mistress, kept by her and locked by her, and entered by others only at her leave. In a great house, she might have a stillroom made to help her, a young woman being taught the craft much as she herself had once been taught it, and together they kept the room and did its work. But the room was hers, its key hung at her own girdle, and within its quiet walls she was, in the plainest sense, the master of her own art. Let us turn now to the greatest of the arts practiced there, the drawing of waters, and see how it was done. Of all the work of the stillroom, distilling was the highest and the most admired, the crown of a gentlewoman's craft. To distill was to draw off the very virtue of a plant, its scent, and its healing power both, and to gather it into a clear water that could be kept long after the flower that gave it had withered and gone. The old books spoke of it almost reverently, as a way of separating the fine from the gross, the spirit from the body, and though the language was borrowed from the alchemists and their long search for hidden things, the work itself was plain and practical and done in a great many ordinary houses by women who thought nothing of it beyond the keeping of their families well. There were two chief ways of doing it, and a careful woman knew which to use for which material. There was the cold still, in which the herbs were warmed only very gently, sometimes by no more than the heat of the sun through a window, or the low warmth of a bed of horse dung fermenting beneath the vessel, and left for a long while to give up their water slowly and without scorching. This was the way for the tender, sweet-smelling flowers, for the rose and the violet and the elder-flower, whose delicate scent a fierce heat would only destroy. And there was the hot still, the alembic set over its own fire, for the stronger stuff, the tough roots and the woody herbs, and the making of the strong spirit itself, where real heat was needed to drive off the vapor. The making of a rose water shows the gentler way at its best. The petals were gathered early, while the dew was scarcely off them, and their scent was at its fullest, and they were laid in the body of the still, sometimes with a little water, and sometimes in their own moisture alone. A low and even heat was raised beneath them, no more than would coax the vapor up without burning. And then began the long patience of the work, the watching and the waiting, while the drops gathered one by one in the cool of the worm and fell, slow as a clock, into the glass below. It could not be hurried. To hurry it was to spoil it, to scorch the petals and taint the water with the smell of burning. And so the woman at the still learned above all things to wait, to tend her fire and mind her drops, and let the work take exactly as long as it needed. At the stronger end of the craft stood the making of aqua vita, the water of life, which was nothing other than the drawing of a strong spirit from wine or from ale by the heat of the still. This was the fierce and potent water that lay at the heart of so many of the cordials and the medicines, the thing that carried the virtue of other herbs steeped in it and preserved them against decay. To make it well took skill and care, for the first running of the still was not the best, and the spirit was often drawn a second time, and even a third, each redistilling making it clearer and stronger, until at last it stood ready in its bottle, clear as spring water, and far from as innocent. Upon this strong water, a great part of the stillroom's more powerful medicine was built. Everything about the work rewarded patience and punished haste. The heat had to be judged by eye, and by long habit, raised a little and eased a little as the running slowed. The vessels had to be clean past any doubt. for the least taint spoiled a whole distillation. The season had to be seized, for a flower distills only while it blooms, and the rose water of the whole coming year had to be drawn in the few short weeks the roses were open. And so the summer, in a working still room, was a busy time of gathering and drawing, flower after flower coming into its brief season and being caught, before it faded, in the clear amber of a bottle that would last until the flowers came again. There was, for all its plainness, a quiet wonder in the thing that the women who did it seemed to have felt. To take a heap of petals that would be brown and spoiled within days, and to draw from them a water that held their whole sweetness a year and more, was a small daily miracle worked over a low fire, and it is easy to understand why the old writers reached for the language of alchemy to describe it. The alchemists, it was said, sought in their furnaces to change base metal into gold and to distill the very elixir of long life, and never found it. The gentlewoman at her still sought something humbler, and found it every summer, a clear sweet water that eased a fever or gladdened a sinking heart, drawn by the same patient art from nothing grander than the flowers of her own garden. When the drawing was done, the waters had to be kept, and the keeping was an art of its own, and the store that resulted was the true wealth of the room, a shelf of clear bottles, each holding the caught essence of some past bright day. It is to that shelf, and to the particular waters that stood upon it, that we turn now. On the shelf of a well-kept still room stood a row of clear bottles, and in them was gathered the caught essence of a whole year of gardens and hedgerows, each water distilled memory of some past bright season, kept against the day it would be needed. To take one down and draw the stopper was to release, in a small cold room in the deep of winter, the exact scent of a June morning years gone by, and the women who kept these waters valued them as much for that quiet comfort as for any healing in them. First and best loved among them was rose water, the plainest and the most useful of all. Almost every still room made it, and made a great deal of it, for it went into more things than any other water the house possessed. It cooled a hot brow and bathed a sore and reddened eye. It was mixed into 100 medicines to soften their harshness and lend them its sweetness. It flavored the fine dishes of the table and the sugared confections of the cordial cupboard, and it perfumed the hands and the linen of the family. A woman might draw gallons of it in a good rose season, and count none of it wasted, for there was no month of the year in which some use for rose water did not arise. It was the water the whole craft was built around, and the one a new still room maid was set to make first, before she was trusted with anything rarer. Beside the rose stood its gentler companions, the elderflower water drawn from the creamy blossom of the hedgerow elder, cooling and mild and good for the skin and the eyes, and the lavender water, sharp and clean, valued for the head and for the freshening of a stale room, and the water of balm, which is to say lemon balm, sweet and faintly of lemons, given to lift a low and heavy spirit. These were the simple waters, each drawn from a single herb, and each carrying that herb's own particular virtue in a clear and single form, to be given alone or mixed as the trouble required. But the pride of the shelf lay in the compound waters, the great many herbed distillations that were the most elaborate medicines the still room made, and chief among these stood the plague water. Its receipts are among the longest in the old books, calling for a whole apothecary's shop of herbs, angelica and gentian, wormwood and rue, rosemary and betony, and a dozen more besides, all steeped together in strong aqua vita and then drawn off into a single potent water. It was kept, as its name declares, against the great sickness, that recurring terror of the age, and given in small doses at the first sign of a fever, in the hope of driving the poison out through a sweat. Whether it turned aside the plague itself, we may quietly doubt, but a warming, spiced cordial given to a frightened patient did no harm and lent some comfort, and so it kept its honoured place on the shelf of nearly every substantial house through all the long years the plague came and went. Near it stood the surfeit water, made against the disorders of too much rather than too little, the heaviness and the sickness that followed a great feast or a rich and hurried meal. It was a warming, spiced, digestive water, sometimes carrying a little of the sleepy virtue of the poppy in it, taken after an evening of indulgence to settle a rebellious stomach and ease a body back toward comfort. In houses where the table was generous, as the tables of the gentry generally were, a good surfeit water earned its keep many times over across a season of feasting, and its receipt was among those most often begged from a friend whose own was reckoned particularly good. Then there was the water that went by the name of Dr. Stevens, one of the most widely copied of all the household waters, a compound of many spices and herbs drawn in wine spirit, warming and cordial, and reckoned good for a great range of complaints of the stomach and the chest. The old books tell, as they hand the receipt along, a little story with it, that a certain Dr. Stevens had made and used this water and had lived by its virtue to a great and vigorous age, and that the secret of it had passed from him only at his death. Whether the tale was true, or was simply the kind of thing that gathers about a famous remedy, we cannot say. And the women who copied it seem not to have troubled themselves greatly over the question, keeping the story and the receipt together as one inheritance and finding the water good, whatever the truth of its maker's years. There were others still, the aqua mirabilis or wonderful water, a spiced and gilded cordial for the heart and the spirits, the cinnamon water and the mint water and the water of angelica, each with its own use and its own devotees, so that a full stillroom shelf might hold a dozen or a score of different waters, simple and compound, ready for whatever the season and the household should require. And the manner of giving them was gentle and familiar, a spoonful taken alone, or dropped into a cup of wine or warm oil, or poured over a lump of sugar and let to melt upon the tongue, so that even the strongest of the medicines came to the patient softened and made kind. All of this the lady kept in order and in memory, knowing what each bottle held, and how old it was, and what it was good for, drawing on it through the long year as trouble arose, and drawing it afresh each summer when the flowers and the herbs came round again. The waters were, in a sense, the household's medicine made keepable, the fleeting virtue of a growing thing caught and held and stored against need, and the full shelf of them was a plain measure of a good housewife's foresight, a whole coming year of small healings, put by while the sun still shone. Let us turn now to the sweeter and costlier shelf that stood beside it, the cordial cupboard, where medicine and pleasure met most closely of all. The word cordial came, as the learned of the day well knew, from the Latin word for the heart, and a cordial was in the plain understanding of the age, a medicine to comfort and strengthen the heart, and with it the whole flagging spirit of a sick or a sorrowing person. This was no small thing in a world where low spirits and a sinking heart were counted real and dangerous conditions of the body, to be met and answered as surely as a fever or a wound. And so the cordial cupboard held the medicines of comfort, the sweet and the costly and the reviving, and it was of all the stores of the stillroom the one most likely to be locked, for its contents were both precious and pleasant, and would not have lasted long within reach of an idle hand. Chief among its treasures was the confection called Manus Christi, a name that means the hand of Christ, and that tells us at once how highly it was esteemed. It was, in its plainest form, a fine sugar boiled hard with rose water, and poured to set into small tablets, and in its grandest form it carried, worked into the sugar, a little leaf of beaten gold, or a powder of dissolved pearl, the most costly things a medicine could hold. It was given as a restorative to the weak, and the recovering let to melt slowly upon the tongue, a sweetness that was also, in the belief of the age, a genuine strengthener of the heart, and the gold and the pearl within it were thought to lend it a special cordial power all their own. We may smile a little now at the gold and the pearl, but a fainting patient given a sweet and shining lozenge, and told it held the very virtue of gold, was very likely the better for the believing. And the medicine did its quiet work, as much in the mind as in the body. Beside the confections stood the electuaries, which were medicines of a softer kind, powders and herbs and spices worked into a thick paste with honey, or with a rich syrup, and kept in a pot to be taken by the spoonful. The sweetness bound the medicine together, and made it keep, and made it kind to swallow, and a well-made electuary was among the pleasantest ways a bitter physic could be given, especially to a child or to a delicate patient who would balk at a plainer draught. Many of these had names and receipts of great age, handed down from the old physicians through the household books, and a lady might keep several of them by her, one for the chest and one for the stomach, and one simply to comfort and revive. Among the most famous of all the cordial remedies was the powder that went by the name of the Countess of Kent, after the great lady whose manual of physic set it down and spread it far and wide across the country. It was a compound of costly things, of pearl and coral and crab's eyes, and the like, ground fine and mixed, and it was kept as a sovereign cordial against fevers and faintings, and the plague itself. Its very costliness was part of its power in the eyes of the age, for it was believed that such precious substances carried a cordial virtue that humbler herbs could not, and to be given a dose of the Countess of Kent's powder was to be given something reckoned among the most potent comforts the stillroom could offer. At the very grandest end of the cupboard, in the houses that could come by them, stood the two ancient compound medicines that the whole of the old physic held in the highest regard, the treacle and the mithridate. These were not made in the stillroom, but bought, at no small price, from the apothecary, for they held so many ingredients, gathered from so far, that only a professional could compound them, and the best treacle, it was said, came all the way from Venice and bore that city's name. They were kept as the great remedies of last resort, against poison and plague, and the gravest fevers, a spoonful of a dark and bitter and intricate paste that carried the accumulated wisdom and the accumulated hope of more than 1,000 years of medicine. A lady kept a little of it locked away and brought it out only for the worst, and a household that had it felt itself the safer for its mere presence on the shelf. What ran through the whole of the cordial cupboard was the meeting of medicine and pleasure, the plain fact that these remedies were also good things, sweet and precious and kind, offered to the weak and the recovering and the frightened as much for the comfort of them as for any cure. A woman newly risen from childbed was given her cordials to build her strength again. A guest of honor might be offered a candied root or a gilded confection as both a sweetmeat and a courtesy. A sinking heart was met with sweetness and warmth and the reassurance of a costly, shining thing. And in an age when so much of illness could not be cured at all, the giving of comfort was itself a real and valued part of the healer's whole art. It is a gentle thought to hold that the medicine chest of the great house held, close beside its bitter physic, this whole shelf of sweetness kept for no other purpose than to ease and to gladden the suffering. Much of this sweetness, the confections and the candied roots and the syrups that bound the electuaries, depended on another and humbler branch of the stillroom's art, the great seasonal work of preserving, by which the fruits and the flowers of summer were caught in sugar and honey and kept against the barren months. It is to that work and to the winter store it built that we turn now. The great work of preserving belonged to the summer and the early autumn, when the gardens and the orchards and the hedgerows came into their brief abundance, and the whole labor of it had a single quiet purpose behind it, to carry that abundance forward into the winter, when nothing grew, and to have on the shelf, in the cold and barren months, the healing and the sweetness of a summer already gone. The lady of the house and her stillroom maid worked hard through the warm weeks, and the fruit of that work stood in rows of pots and jars along the shelves, a whole court summer waiting to be opened one dark evening at a time. The sweetener that made it all possible was, more and more across these years, sugar. In the earlier age, honey had done most of this work, and honey never left the stillroom, for it was cheap and near and good, gathered from the household's own bees and used in the making of syrups and the binding of electuaries and the dressing of wounds. But sugar, once a rare and princely thing sold in small amounts by the apothecary as a medicine in its own right, grew steadily more common and more affordable through the Tudor and Stuart years, until a gentlewoman could have it by the loaf, and with plentiful sugar the whole art of preserving opened out into the rich variety. The old book's record. Sugar drew the water from a fruit and locked it against decay, and held a flower's color and virtue for a year, and made a bitter medicine into a thing a child would take gladly. And so it stood at the center of the sweeter half of the stillroom's craft. Consider only the conserves, in which a flower or a fruit was beaten together with sugar into a soft, keeping paste that held much of its fresh virtue. The conserve of roses was the queen of them, made from the red petals pounded with sugar, and it was given for a great range of complaints, to strengthen a weak stomach, to comfort the heart, to ease a looseness of the body, a spoonful taken alone or dissolved in a warm drink. There were conserves of violets and of cowslips for the head and for gentle sleep, conserves of rosemary flowers and of borage and bugloss to drive away melancholy and lift a sinking spirit, each flower pounded in its brief season with sugar enough to keep it, and each earning its own place in the treatment of the year to come. Then there were the syrups, made by boiling the juice or the infusion of a herb with sugar to a thick, sweet liquid that kept well and mixed easily into any draught. The syrup of violets was made in nearly every house, cooling and gentle and good for children and for a sore throat, and prized besides for the pretty way it changed its color, so that a cook could use it to tell an acid from an alkali long before any chemist thought to name such things. There was syrup of roses, both the plain and the solutive kind that gently loosened the body, and syrup of coltsfoot and of horehound, and of hyssop for the winter coughs, and syrup of poppy, made with care and given sparingly, to bring sleep to the restless and ease to the pained. A shelf of syrups was a shelf of half the winter's medicine, each bottle a herb's virtue held in sweetness, ready to be spooned into a cup at the first cough of December. The candied things were the prettiest of all the work, and among the most useful. Roots and stems and peels and whole small fruits were boiled in sugar and dried until they stood crisp and clear and keeping. Angelica stems were candied green and given for the chest and the stomach, and eaten besides as a sweetmeat at the table. The root of the eringo, the sea holly, was candied into a restorative that the age reckoned a great strengthener of a weakened body. The peels of oranges and of lemons, those costly imported fruits, were candied and kept both for pleasure and for the comforting of the stomach. Flowers themselves were candied, borage flowers and violets, and rose petals painted with sugar and dried, to sit like small jewels upon a dish of the confections, at once a medicine, a sweetmeat, and an ornament of a genteel table. And there were the marmalades, and the pastes of the firmer fruits, the quinces above all, boiled down with sugar to a thick amber substance that set hard enough to be cut, called marmalade or quidney, given to bind and comfort a disordered stomach, and set out in neat squares as a delicacy after a feast. There were preserved barberries, sharp and red, kept for the sick and for the cooling of a fever. There were dried plums and figs and raisins of the sun, gently laxative and nourishing, kept for the sickroom and the nursery. All of it was medicine, and all of it was food, and the line between the two, here in the sweet half of the stillroom, all but vanished altogether, as a plate of candied roots passed from the sick bed to the banquet table and back again, without anyone thinking the passage strange. Behind the whole of this pleasant, sweet-smelling labor lay the plain foresight that governed the good running of any great house, the knowing that winter would come, and sickness with it, and that the time to lay in the summer's healing was while the summer was there to be laid in. A well-stocked preserving shelf in October was a promise kept to the whole household against the hard months ahead, and the lady who filled it was doing, in her scented and sugary way, exactly what the men of the estate did when they filled the barns with grain and salted down the winter meat, providing, against a lean and dangerous season, out of the plenty of a generous one. Let us turn now from the sweet inward medicines to the outward ones, to the salves and the plasters, and the whole quiet surgery of the house. Not all of the stillroom's medicine was to be swallowed. A great part of it was made to be laid upon the body from without, spread on a sore or bound over a hurt. And this outward physic was as much a part of the lady's craft as any cordial or water. The commonest hurts of a large and hard-working household were exactly the kind that outward remedies answered best. The cuts and grazes of the kitchen and the field, the burns of the fire and the copper, the bruises and sprains of a fall, the boils and the chilblains and the slow, aching sores that would not heal. And for all of these the still-room kept its salves, and its plasters ready in their pots, and its wrappings folded near at hand. The salves were made upon a base of fat, of rendered suet, or hog's lard, or beeswax melted with a sweet oil, into which the virtue of the healing herbs was worked. And the greatest of them was the green wound salve, made from a gathering of the wound herbs of the countryside. Into it went the plantain, that grew in every path, and the self-heal, whose very name declared its use, and the woundwort and the bugle and the ribwort, and the golden petals of the calendula, all bruised and their virtue drawn into the warm fat, so that the finished salve was green with the herbs that made it, and was spread on a clean cloth, and bound over a cut to close it clean. The comfrey, called knitbone, had its own place here, its grated root and bruised leaf, laid over a bruise or a strain, or packed about a broken limb, where it dried to hold the bone steady, a remedy the plain effectiveness of which even the travelling physicians of the age remarked upon with some surprise. Beside the salve stood the medicinal oils, made by the gentle way of steeping the herbs in a sweet oil and setting the glass in the summer sun for many weeks, until the oil drew out the colour and the virtue of the flower. The oil of roses was made so, cooling and soft, for a hot swelling or an aching head. The oil of St. John's wort was the most striking of them, for the little yellow flowers, steeped in oil and set in the sun, turned the whole of it a deep and blood red, and this red oil was the great remedy for burns and for wounds, rubbed gently over a scald or a raw place to ease the pain and speed the healing. To watch a clear oil slowly redden over a summer windowsill was one of the small quiet wonders of the craft, and the oil that resulted was among the most reached for medicines the whole house possessed. Then there were the plasters and the poultices, the medicines spread thick and laid warm upon the skin. A poultice or cataplasm was a soft warm mass of boiled herbs or of bread soaked in milk or of a mash of roots laid upon a swelling or a boil to draw it and to ease it, renewed as often as it cooled. A plaster was a firmer thing, a medicated substance spread upon leather or upon cloth and bound in place to stay for days. Some meant to draw a corruption out of a sore, some to strengthen a weak back or an aching joint with their warmth and their aromatic gums. The making of these was a real skill, the judging of the heat and the spreading of the mass and the binding of it just so, neither too tight nor too loose, and a lady learned it as she learned everything else in that room, by long watching and long practice at another woman's side. In all of this she was, in the plainest sense, the surgeon of her own household for the lesser hurts, and often for the greater ones too, when no better help could be had. She dressed the wounds and changed the bindings. She watched a sore to see whether it healed clean or turned angry. She set the small bones and bound the sprains, and drew the splinters and lanced the ripe boils. The Yorkshire gentlewoman Margaret Hoby, whose diary we have already met, recorded such work among her ordinary days without any fuss at all: the dressing of a sore leg, the tending of a hurt that others in the household could not or would not tend, all of it set down in the same even hand as her prayers and her housekeeping. It was simply part of what a mistress did, this quiet, sometimes unlovely work of the body's outward troubles, and she did it, by every account, with the same steady competence she brought to the running of the whole great house around her. Yet the stillroom was not only a place of sickness and of hurt. It was also, and by no means least, a place of pleasure and of sweetness and of the small graces of a genteel life, where scented waters and sweet bags and fragrant things were made with the same hands and by the same arts as the medicines, and where the border between physic and delight grew as soft as anywhere in the house. Let us turn now to that gentler side of the room, to the scents and the sweetness and the quiet marks of gentility, the same still that drew a physic water, for a fever drew also the sweet waters, that had nothing to do with sickness at all, and the same careful hands that spread a healing salve rolled also the scented pomanders and stitched the sweet bags that perfumed a whole house. For the still-room was, in a very real way, the perfumery of the manor as well as its dispensary, and a great part of its steady work through the year was the making of pleasant things, of scents and sweetness, and the small fragrant graces that marked a house as a gentle one. To the woman who kept the room, there was no sharp line between the two labors. Both drew the virtue of a flower into a keeping form, both asked the same patience and the same skill, and both served, in the understanding of the age, the health and the comfort of the household, for sweetness of air and sweetness of body were reckoned near cousins to health itself. Chief among the pleasant waters were the sweet distilled waters made not for medicine, but for scent, the damask rose water valued above all for its fragrance, the water of orange flowers where such costly blossom could be had, the waters of lavender and of sweet marjoram and of the many fragrant herbs of the garden. These were kept to perfume the hands and the face, to freshen a close and stuffy room, to scent the water in which fine linen was rinsed, and to be sprinkled from a pierced casting bottle over a guest or a table on an occasion of some ceremony. A lady might offer a basin of warm rose water for the washing of hands before a meal, and the sweetness of it was at once a courtesy, a pleasure, and, in the belief of the day, a small guard of the health. For cleanliness and sweet scent were thought to keep off the corruption that bred in foulness. For the linen and the clothes there were the sweet bags, small stitched pillows of fragrant stuff laid among the folded sheets in the presses and hung among the gowns in the chests. Into them went dried lavender above all, and dried rose petals, and the root of the orris, which is the iris, whose dried root smells faintly and lastingly of violets and holds and lends its scent to everything about it. There went sweet marjoram and rosemary, and the dried peel of oranges and lemons, and sometimes a costly grain of musk, or a little powdered spice, and the finished bag laid its quiet fragrance into the linen for months, so that a fresh sheet drawn from the press in midwinter carried still the ghost of the summer garden that had scented it. The making and refreshing of these bags was one of the pleasantest of the stillroom's tasks, and one a young girl was often set to early, being safe and sweet and hard to spoil. Then there was the pomander, that curious and elegant thing, a ball of fragrant paste carried or worn about the person. It was made of a base that would hold a scent and keep it, worked together with the precious perfumes of the age, and pierced or set in a little pierced case of gold or silver to hang from a girdle or a chain. It was carried for pleasure, for the sweetness it lent to its wearer, but it was carried also, and perhaps more, for the health of it, for the whole age believed that disease travelled on foul and corrupted air, and that a strong sweet scent held close to the nose could turn that bad air aside. A pomander held to the face in a crowded or a stinking place, or in a time of fever in the town, was thought a real guard against infection, and so it was at once a jewel, a perfume, and a piece of preventive physic, worn most anxiously in exactly the seasons when sickness walked abroad. The care of the body itself gave the still-room further work, for here too the age reached readily for the fragrant and the herbal. There were the washing bowls, which were scented bowls of soap made, or improved at home, worked with sweet powders and rose water for the cleansing and the softening of the hands, a real luxury in a world where plain soap was harsh. There were sweet powders to be dusted among the hair, and the linen and tooth powders of ground, and pleasant things to clean and whiten the teeth, and waters and ointments for the complexion, to smooth a chapped skin or fade a blemish or soften a hand roughened by the cold. Some of these shaded so near to medicine as to be indistinguishable from it, a salve for chapped lips being at once a comfort, a cosmetic, and a cure, and the receipt book set them all down together without troubling to sort the one kind from the other. The very floors and rooms of the house drew on the still-room's fragrant stores. It was the custom of the age to strew the floors of the better rooms with sweet herbs and rushes, with meadowsweet, whose old name of Queen of the Meadow spoke of exactly this use, and with lavender and balm and the fragrant grasses, so that a footfall crushed a sweetness up out of the floor itself. Fragrant woods and gums and dried herbs were burned upon the coals to perfume a chamber, especially a sick-room or a room lately shut up, both for the pleasure of the scent and again for the driving off of the corrupt air that was thought to breed and carry disease. A house that smelled sweet was a house reckoned wholesome, and the keeping of that sweetness fell, like so much else, to the lady and her fragrant room. All of this had, beyond its pleasure and its supposed healthfulness, a plain social meaning too. For the making of sweet and delicate things was one of the marks by which a household showed itself gentle. A banquet, in the sense the age gave the word, was a course of sweet confections and candied fruits and sugar work, served often in a little banqueting house in the garden or on the leads of the roof. And the making of this banqueting stuff was among the proudest displays of the still-room's art. To set before one's guests a dish of one's own candied flowers and gilded confections and delicate marchpane, made by one's own hands and by no bought skill, was to show at once one's wealth, one's leisure, and one's accomplishment. And a lady famed for her banqueting stuff and her sweet waters held a real and pleasant distinction among her neighbours. So the still-room served the household's standing in the world as surely as it served its health, and the two purposes ran together, as they did in so much of a gentlewoman's life, until they could scarcely be told apart. Yet for all this sweetness and gentility, the room's first and gravest business remained the care of the sick, and the sick of a great house were a various company indeed, ranged across the whole steep order of the household, from the highest to the very lowest. Let us turn now to that company, to all the different bodies that came, in their troubles, to the lady's door. A working manor was a small and crowded world, and nearly every soul in it, sooner or later, had need of the lady's physic. Consider first the servants, who were the many, and whose hard bodily work bred its own steady harvest of hurts and ailments. The dairymaids and the laundresses had hands cracked and chapped raw by cold water and by lye and chilblains in the winter, and for them the stillroom kept its softening salves and its healing oils. The cooks and the kitchen boys took the burns and the scalds of the fire and the great copper, and to them went the cooling oil of St. John's wort and the salve of calendula. The grooms and the stable lads were kicked and thrown and crushed against stalls, and came with bruises and sprains, and the odd broken bone, for which there was comfrey and the binding cloth. The field workers and the shepherds, out in all weathers, brought in the agues and the rheums, and the deep aching colds that damp and hardship breed. And the porter at the gate had his stiff and swollen joints, and the old servants kept on in kindness past their working strength, had all the slow complaints of age. To all of these the lady was bound, by custom and by conscience, to give what help she could. A servant who fell sick in a great house did not, as a rule, fend for himself. He was tended within the household, and the tending of him fell first to the mistress and her stillroom, for the bond between a master's house and its servants was understood to run both ways, service on the one side answered by care and protection on the other. A good mistress saw her sick servants dozed and dressed and, if need be, sat with, and a household known to treat its people, so was a household that kept its servants and drew others gladly to its service. So the daily round of the stillroom was crowded with the small troubles of the many. The wetlow on a maid's finger, the cough that ran through the kitchen in February, the strained back of a man who had lifted badly, each brought to the lady, and each, in its turn, quietly answered. Nor was the family itself spared the common ills. The master of the house, for all his rank, was as liable to sickness as any of his people, and rather more liable to some of them, for the very richness of his life bred its own diseases. The gout was the great affliction of the well-fed gentleman, the painful swelling of the joints that the age tied, not wrongly, to a life of rich meats and strong wines, and the lady kept her poultices and her purges and her comforting cordials for the master's gouty foot as faithfully as for any servant's ague. There was the stone, that agony of the age which no one could truly cure, only ease, and the rheumatism of a life spent much on horseback in the wet, and the wounds and the falls of hunting and of the rougher sports, and the same fevers and fluxes and winter coughs that visited the whole house without regard to rank. The lady tended her own body too, and her daughters, with the same store, and it is worth remembering that she was often her own physician first, dosing herself through the long trials of many childbeds and the ordinary sicknesses of a hard-working life, keeping her own strength up with the cordials she made for others. She stood, in the plainest sense, at the very center of the health of the whole house, the one person to whom every other, high or low, might come, and from whose hands the first, and often the only remedy came for all of them alike. There was, to be sure, some difference in what she gave to whom. The costly cordials, the gilded confections, the precious powders of pearl and coral, were kept in the main for the family and for the graver illnesses, while the servants had the plainer and the cheaper stuff, the common salves and the herb waters and the simple syrups. made in bulk from the garden's own plenty. But this was a difference of degree, and not of kind, the same knowledge and the same care reaching down through the whole household, adjusted only to what each illness needed, and what each patient's place could command. From the scullery boy asleep by the kitchen fire to the Lord Gouty in his great chamber, all of them lay in sickness within the compass of one woman's quiet and unresting care. And when the illness was grave, and the patient took to his bed for days or weeks, there began a whole further branch of the lady's work, the long, patient tending of the sickroom itself, the making of the soft, nourishing foods a sick body could take, the keeping of the chamber, the sitting up through the dark hours. Let us turn now to that quiet and tender labor, and to the comforts of the sickroom. When an illness was grave enough to keep a body in its bed for days together, the lady's care widened from the giving of a remedy into the whole long tending of a sickroom, and much of that tending had to do with food, for a sick body must be fed, and fed gently, with things soft and warm and easy to take. Here, more than anywhere, the old truth that food and medicine were one showed itself plainly, for the dishes made for the sick were built to nourish and to comfort and to carry physic all at once, and the making of them was as much a part of the stillroom's art as any distilled water. Foremost among these were the cordials, warm and thickened drinks that were the great standby of the sickroom and the childbed alike. A cordial was made upon a base of ale or of wine, warmed and sweetened and spiced, and thickened with the yolks of eggs beaten in, sometimes enriched further with a little fine bread or oatmeal, until it was a warm and nourishing thing, halfway between a drink and a broth. It was given to the weak and the recovering, to those who could stomach little else, a spoonful or a small cupful at a time, and into it the lady might stir whatever gentle physic the patient needed, so that the medicine came warm and sweet, and half disguised in the comfort of the cordial. A good cordial, well made and kindly given, was one of the plainest and best loved services a sick person could receive, and the making of it was among the first sickroom skills a young gentlewoman learned. Near cousin to the cordial was the posset, made from hot milk poured onto ale or wine or sack, which is a strong sweet Spanish wine, so that the milk curdled and parted into a soft curd above and a spiced liquor below. Spiced and sweetened, the posset was a warming, sweating, comforting drink, given most often at bedtime, and most often for a cold or the first chill of a fever, in the plain hope of driving the sickness out through a good sweat under heavy covers. The sack posset was a famous and cherished thing, rich and strong, given as much for comfort as for cure, and the receipt for a particularly good one was among those a woman might be proud of, and her neighbours glad to have of her. Then there were the broths and the jellies, the restorative foods for those who needed building up again after a long sickness. A broth of a capon or of good mutton, simmered long and clear, sometimes with strengthening herbs like borage and biglos set to steep in it, was reckoned a great restorer of a wasted body, and was given by the cupful through a slow recovery. The jelly made by the long boiling of a calf's foot or of hartshorn, the shaving of a deer's antler, set to a clear trembling jelly, and lightly sweetened and spiced, was another prized restorative, easy to swallow and thought very nourishing, given to the gravely weak and to women newly out of childbed. These things took hours of patient labor over a low fire, and they were made for one patient at a time. Small, careful offerings of strength, cooked up out of kindness and long simmering. For the fevered, whose trouble was heat, and who could bear nothing rich, there were the cooling and the simple foods and drinks. Barley water, made by the long boiling of barley and strained clear, was given by the jugful to cool and to soothe. Almond milk, ground almonds steeped and pressed to a smooth white milk, was a gentle nourishment for those who could take no animal food, and was thought cooling and kind in a fever. There was whey, the thin part left when milk was curdled, given as a light and cooling drink, and there was the plain water gruel and the panada of bread boiled soft to a pap, for those too weak or too sick for anything more. Each of these had its place, matched to the nature of the illness by the old logic of hot and cold. The cooling things for the fevered and the warming, nourishing things for the chilled and the wasted. Around all this food and physic lay the keeping of the sickroom itself, which was an art of its own. The chamber was kept warm and often kept dark, the light being thought hard on a fevered head, and it was kept as sweet and clean as the household could manage. The linen changed, the air freshened with sweet herbs burned upon the coals, or with a scattering of fragrant water. The whole close world of the sick person tended to comfort the body and to keep off, as the age believed, the corrupt air that might deepen the disease. The patient was washed and turned and made easy. The pillows shifted, the drinks kept ready warm, 100 small tendernesses done through the day to ease a body that could do nothing for itself. And there was the watching, the sitting up through the long dark hours, beside a patient too ill to be left alone. This fell to the lady, or to a trusted servant, or to the women of the house by turns. And it was among the hardest and the most faithful of the sickroom's labours, the keeping awake through the small hours by a single candle, the giving of a drink at intervals, the listening to the breathing, the being simply and steadily there in case of need or of the end. It asked no great skill, only love and endurance, and it was given again and again to the sick of the whole household, high and low, by women who had already worked a full day and would work another when the dawn came. It is one of the quietest and least recorded of all their labours, this patient watching in the dark, and one of the truest measures of the care that ran through the whole of the work. Of all the occasions that called a woman to the bedside of another, none was more wholly a woman's affair than childbirth, and it is to that oldest and most female of the household's concerns, the childbed and the long lying in that followed it, that we turn now. Childbirth, in the world of the manor, as in every other world of the age, belonged almost entirely to women. When a woman's time came, it was women who gathered to her, the midwife who had the skill of it, and the circle of female kin and neighbours and friends who came to attend and to help and to keep her company, called by the old and tender name of the gossips, which meant simply the women who stood with her through her trial. Men had no part in the birthing chamber, and the lady of the house stood at the very heart of this female world, both as the one who bore the children of the family through many dangerous years, and as the one who tended her own women, her servants and her tenants, through their own confinements, with the cordials and the comforts of her stillroom. The birthing chamber was made ready in a particular way, shut up warm and dark against the light and the air, the windows covered and the room kept close and hushed, in keeping with the belief of the age that the labouring woman and her coming child must be sheltered from any chill or any harshness of the outer world. Here the gossips gathered, and here the long, slow work of a birth went forward among women, with prayer and encouragement and the plain physical help of many practiced hands. There were customs of comfort particular to the occasion, the groaning cake and the groaning cheese made ready for the gathered women to share, and above all the groaning Cordial, the warm, spiced, strengthening drink kept always at hand to give the labouring woman what strength and heart the long hours demanded. The stillroom kept its own store of remedies thought to belong to the childbed. There were the herbs long trusted in this work, the raspberry leaf made into a tea and taken through the later months, the mugwort and the motherwort and the birthwort, whose very names carried their reputation, all used, gently and hopefully, to ease and to strengthen, and to bring a hard labour to a good end. There were cordials and caudals to keep up the mother's strength, and, when the child was safely come, the whole apparatus of restoration for a body worn out and endangered by its trial. The strengthening broths and jellies, and the sweet cordials of the cupboard, brought out in her honour. Much of this the lady would have from her mother and her gossips, birth lore being among the most closely and warmly shared of all women's knowledge, passed from the delivered to the about to be delivered in an unbroken chain of hard-won experience. After the birth came the lying in, the long month of rest and seclusion that custom granted, and rightly, to a woman recovering from her ordeal. For something like a month she kept to her chamber, and then to the house, waited on and fed up, and spared all labour. Her strength slowly gathered again with cordials and rich broths, and the tender care of the women about her, until at the month's end she rose and went to be churched, the service of thanksgiving that marked her return to the ordinary life of the parish. This month of the lying in was a real and humane provision, a recognized season of care built into the life of the household, and the keeping of it well, with all its comforts and cordials and quiet, was one more charge upon the lady and her stillroom. We must not pass over the danger of all this too lightly, for childbed was, in that age, a real and present peril, and a woman going into her labour knew it, and set her affairs and her soul in order beforehand, who might not return. The comforts and the cordials and the gathered women could ease and could strengthen, but they could not always save, and the shadow over the birthing chamber was a real one. Yet the response of the women to that shadow was not terror, but a kind of steady, practical tenderness, the gathering close, the sharing of the burden, the doing of every small comforting thing that could be done, and the meeting of a hard and dangerous passage with company and warmth and skill rather than with fear. It is a moving thing to consider, this circle of women closing warmly and knowingly about one of their own in her hour of danger, armed with nothing but their herbs and their cordials and their long-shared experience, and giving all of it freely. Out of the childbed came, in time, the children, and the children brought their own long train of small sicknesses to the lady's door. The coughs and the fevers, and the troubles of the breeding of teeth, a whole further branch of the household's physic, given over to the care of its youngest and most fragile members. Let us turn now to the nursery and to the tending of the children of the house. The children of the house were among the most frequent visitors to the still-room door, or rather the most frequent occasions of a visit, for they came in their nurse's arms as often as on their own feet, and the small troubles of childhood filled a great part of the lady's daily physic. Children sickened easily in that age, and died easily too, and the shadow of that plain fact lay over every nursery, so that the smallest cough or the least fever was watched with an anxious care we can well understand, and answered with all the gentle art the household possessed. The breeding of teeth, as the age called the cutting of a child's first teeth, was reckoned a real danger and not a mere discomfort, blamed for fevers and fits and fluxes, and much else that troubled an infant in its first years. Against it the lady kept her gentle helps, things to rub upon the sore, and swollen gums to ease them, and syrups to soothe the fretful child, and above all the coral, that smooth red branch of the sea, which was given to an infant both to bite upon, for the hard cool comfort of it against the aching gum, and to wear, for the old and widespread belief that coral about a child guarded it from harm and from the evil eye. The little coral and bells. A stick of polished coral set in a silver handle hung with small bells was at once a plaything, a teething aid, and a charm, and a great many children of the gentry were given one, and gnawed it, and shook it, through the long uneasy months of their first teeth. Worms were another of the constant troubles of childhood, believed then to be far more common and more dangerous than we now hold them, and blamed for a child's thinness or fretfulness or want of appetite. Against them the still-room kept its bitter remedies, the wormwood whose very name declared its use, and the tansy, and the bitter wormseed, given in small careful doses, often folded into honey or a sweet syrup to get them past a reluctant child, and followed sometimes by a gentle purge to carry the trouble away. It was unpleasant physic, bitter by its nature, and the disguising of it in sweetness was one of the small daily kindnesses of the nursery, a spoonful of honey to carry a bitter thing, the oldest trick of the sickroom, and still among the best. The coughs and colds of childhood were met with the sweet syrups the still-room made in plenty, the syrup of violets, and of coltsfoot, and of hyssop, and honey warmed with a little of some soothing herb. Gentle things fit for a small body and a tender throat. The worse coughs, the long racking chin cough that ran through the children of a household and would not quickly let go, were tended with these same soothing syrups, and with patience, and with the warm possets that eased the chest and coaxed a sweat. Fevers were cooled with barley water, and thin drinks, and kept watch over anxiously, for a child in a high fever was a frightening thing, and the eruptive fevers that the age knew all too well, spoken of here only as the sad commonplaces of that world, were watched for with particular dread, and tended with cooling drinks and careful nursing and a great deal of prayer. There was, too, the trouble that the physicians of that century began to note and to name as a disease particularly of English children, the softening and bending of the young bones that they called the rickets, and against it the still-room and the physician alike tried what they could, strengthening broths and baths and such helps as the age could devise, with what success we may quietly doubt. And there were the fits and the frights, and the 100 small alarms of a nursery full of young children, each met with a gentle remedy and a comforting arm, the physic of childhood being always as much a matter of soothing and holding and reassuring as of any herb or syrup. Behind the tending of the children stood the whole apparatus of their early care. The wet nurse chosen with anxious attention to her health and her temper, for it was believed the child drank in something of the nurse's nature with her milk, the swaddling and the keeping warm, the watching over of the fragile first months and years. The lady oversaw all of this for her own children, and often for the children of her servants and tenants too. And the syrups and the cooling drinks and the gentle purges of the nursery were among the most constantly made of all her medicines, for there was rarely a season when some child of the great household was not ailing in some small way, and in need of them. We should hold gently in mind, through all of this, how many of these small patients did not grow up, for the death of children was the common grief of every family of the age, high and low alike. And the lady who dozed and soothed and watched over the nursery did so knowing that not all her care would keep them, that she gave the care anyway, fully and tenderly, into every small illness that might be the last or might be nothing at all, is one more quiet mark of the whole spirit of the work, the meeting of a hard and uncertain world with steady kindness and with every art the household could bring to bear. Let us turn now beyond the walls of the house altogether, to the poor of the parish who came to the lady's gate, and to the charity that was so large a part of her whole calling. The care the lady gave did not stop at her own threshold. It reached out, as a matter of plain Christian duty and of long custom, to the poor of the parish beyond her gate, the cottagers and the labourers and their families who had no physician within their reach and no coin to pay one if they had, and for whom the lady of the manor was, very often, the only medicine there was. They came to her door with their agues and their sores and their sick children, having walked, some of them, a good distance to lay their trouble before her, and she gave them, freely and without fee, the same herb waters and salves and syrups her own household used, and her counsel with them, and sometimes food and other help besides. This dispensing of medicine to the poor was understood, in the language of the age, as one of the first and clearest of the good works to which a Christian of comfortable estate was called. To visit the sick, to heal them where one could and comfort them where one could not, was named plainly among the duties of charity, and the godly gentlewoman took it up as a part of her religion, so that her physic and her prayers were, as we have already seen, near neighbours in her mind, and often on the same page of her book. A lady who let the sick poor come to her, and gave them freely of her skill and her stores, was doing what she understood her faith and her station alike to require of her, and she did it, by every surviving account, in very large measure. The diaries and the papers that come down to us show this charity at work in real lives. The Yorkshire gentlewoman Margaret Hoby, whose ordinary days we have already followed, went out among her neighbours and her tenants to tend their sicknesses and dress their hurts as readily as she tended her own household, setting the work down among her devotions as one more part of a godly life. Grace Mildmay, another gentlewoman of the age, and one of the most careful of all the female healers whose records survive, is remembered for treating rich and poor alike, keeping her notes and her remedies, and giving her skill freely to those who came to her, over a lifetime of quiet and serious practice. These were not rare exceptions, but the visible examples of a thing that went on, unrecorded, at manor gates across the whole country. The steady giving of medicine down the social scale from those who had the knowledge and the means to those who had neither. So common and so expected did this become that the very figure of the charitable lady of the manor, dispensing her cordials and her salves to the grateful poor, passed into the common imagination of the age, and was remembered long after in the proverbial name of the Lady Bountiful, the great lady whose open hand and healing stillroom were the plain resort of a whole neighborhood in its troubles. The name carries, to a later ear, a faint smile in it, but the thing itself was real and was serious, and for the poor who had no other help it was very far from a small matter, being quite literally, in many a fever and many a hurt, the difference between care and none at all. We should not pretend the charity was wholly free of the world it grew in. It bound the poor to the manor in gratitude and in deference, and it confirmed the lady in her place at the head of the little world of the parish, and no doubt some who gave it thought as much of the standing it brought them as of the good it did. But to weigh it only, so would be to miss the greater part of the truth, for the surviving records leave little doubt that a great many of these women gave their care out of a plain and genuine goodness, rising in the night for a sick cottager's child, walking out in the wet to a dying tenant, spending their skill and their costly stores on people who could give them nothing in return but thanks. The charity was real, whatever else it also was, and it reached, through the long years, a great many people who would otherwise have suffered and died with no comfort at all. All of this giving, to household and to parish alike, rested upon a steady supply of the herbs and the drugs, and the sweet things from which the medicines were made, and that supply came from more than one source, from the manor's own ground first of all, but also from the wider world of the market and the apothecary's shop. Let us turn now to where all of it came from, beginning with the garden and the hedgerow closest to hand. The nearest and the dearest source of the stillroom's materials was the manor's own ground, the gardens and the orchard, and the fields that lay all about the house, and from these came the greater part of the common herbs on which the daily physic was built. A well-ordered manor kept, among its several gardens, a garden of herbs, sometimes a proper physic garden set apart, sometimes only a generous herb quarter, within the kitchen garden, where the plants most wanted in the stillroom were grown close and tended carefully, in neat beds laid out for easy gathering. Here grew the sage and the rosemary and the rue, the hyssop and the wormwood and the angelica, the marigolds and the poppies and the balm, the whole familiar company of the healing herbs, planted where the lady could walk out and cut what she needed at the season of its strength. The kitchen garden gave its own double harvest, for a great many of its plants served the pot and the medicine chest alike, the fennel and the dill and the parsley, the garlic and the onion and the leek, the pot herbs that seasoned the food and eased the body in the same breath. The orchard gave its fruits, the apples and quinces and plums and cherries, which were as much medicine as food in the reckoning of the age, cooked into the conserves and the syrups and the marmalades of the cordial cupboard. And the flower garden gave the roses above all, grown in quantity for the sake of the stillroom's endless need of them, and the violets and the gilliflowers and the cowslips, flowers grown as much for the physic and the sweet water they yielded as for their beauty in the border. Beyond the tended ground lay the wilder harvest of the hedgerow, and the field and the waste places, and this too the household drew upon, gathering from the wild what it did not trouble to grow. The elder in the hedge gave its flowers and its berries, the hawthorn its blossom and its haws, the nettle and the plantain, and the self-heal grew for the taking along every path and headland, and the meadows gave their meadow-sweet, and their wild herbs in season. Much of this wild gathering was done by the lady's servants, or by the poor of the parish who knew the plants, and were glad to bring in a basket of them, for a small payment or a kindness, so that the knowledge of the wild herbs ran down through the whole neighbourhood, and up again to the manor, the humblest cottager, and the lady meeting, as it were, over a handful of gathered elderflower. The growing and gathering had its own calendar, as strict in its way as the calendar of the harvest, each herb to be taken at its proper season and in its proper state, the leaves before the plant flowered, the flowers newly open, the roots lifted when the virtue had drawn down into them at the year's turn. What was gathered had then to be dried and stored against the year, hung in bunches from the beams of a dry and airy loft, or spread on frames, and turned and watched until it was crisp and keeping, and then laid up in the boxes and jars of the stillroom, labelled and dated, a whole year's supply of each herb put by while it could be had. The drying and the storing were as much a part of the craft as the growing, for a herb ill-dried was a herb half-spoiled, and the well-kept drying loft, fragrant and rustling, was one of the quiet treasuries of the working house. Even the garden was caught up in the great network of exchange among the women, for plants and seeds travelled between the houses exactly as receipts did. A root of some good herb sent to a friend with a letter, a paper of seeds enclosed with a receipt for the water to be made from the plant they would grow into. The age was, besides, a great time of new plants coming into England from the wider world, strange flowers and useful herbs carried home by travellers and gardeners and set to grow in English ground for the first time, so that a lady's garden might hold, beside its ancient native herbs, some novelty lately arrived from a far country, its uses still being learned and shared about. The garden, like the book and the letter, was a living thing that grew and changed and passed its increase from hand to hand. Yet for all the garden and the hedgerow could give, there was much the manor's own ground could not supply, and for these things the lady turned outward to the shop and the market and the wider trade of the age. Let us turn now to that other source of her materials, to the apothecary and the grocer and all that came from far away. However rich her garden, there were things the lady could not grow in English soil, and for these she went, or sent, to the shops of the town, to the apothecary and the grocer, and the spicer who dealt in the goods of the wider world. Chief among these bought materials was sugar itself, without which half the cordial cupboard and the whole art of preserving could not have gone forward. Brought from far away and sold by the loaf, once a princely rarity, and now, across these years, an ever more ordinary purchase in a gentle household's accounts. Beside it came the spices, the pepper and ginger and cinnamon, the cloves and nutmeg and mace, the costly saffron, all of them valued as much for their virtue in medicine as for their savour in food, warming and comforting things that went into the cordials and the spiced waters and the caudles of the sickroom. Then there were the drugs proper, the medicinal substances gathered from across the whole known world and sold in the apothecary's shop, things no garden of the temperate north could ever yield. There was rhubarb, the root brought by long trade routes out of the Far East, prized above almost all other purges for the gentleness and the reliability of its working, and dear in price to match its reputation. There was senna, and there was aloes for the same purposes, and myrrh and frankincense and mastic, the fragrant gums of hot countries, and the strange resins with names like dragon's blood, and from the newly opened lands across the Western Ocean came novelties like the wood called guaiacum and the root called sarsaparilla, hopefully tried against the diseases the old remedies could not touch. The apothecary's shelves were a map of the whole trading world, and a portion of what stood on them found its way, in small costly amounts, into the stores of the Manor stillroom. Some medicines the lady did not attempt to make at all, but bought ready compounded, for they were beyond the making of any but a professional. The great ancient remedies of treacle and mithridate, with their scores of ingredients, came so from the apothecary, and so did various other elaborate confections and pills whose composition was too intricate or whose ingredients too rare for the household to gather. In this the lady and the apothecary were partners rather than rivals, she making the great bulk of the ordinary physic at home and buying from him the few things she could not make or grow, and reading, no doubt, a good deal from his knowledge as she did her business with him. She was, in this buying, a knowing and a careful customer, for the goods were costly and their quality various, and a gentlewoman learned to judge her rhubarb and her spices, and to know when she was well served and when she was cheated. Much of the buying was done at a distance, by letter and by carrier, an order sent up to London or to the county town and the goods sent down, and the accounts of a great house record these purchases in their steady columns, so many ounces of this and so many pounds of that, a plain ledger of the reach of a single stillroom out into the trade of the world. To keep such accounts, to order wisely, to get good value in costly things, was one more part of the whole competence the running of the medicine of a great house demanded. The age itself was pouring new remedies into these shops, as the ships came home from ever further voyages. And the later years of our story saw the arrival of one that would in time overturn a great part of the old physic of fevers, the bark of a Peruvian tree, brought back across the ocean and found to answer, as nothing before it truly had, against the shaking eggs that had tormented Europe out of mind. It came slowly and was received slowly, told of and doubted and tried. One more marvel among the many the new trade was carrying home, and a lady near the end of our period might have had a little of this new bark upon her shelf, its powers still half a wonder, standing among her ancient herbs and waters as a small sign of a changing world. Let us turn now to the plainest materials of all, the common things of the kitchen and the dairy that every household kept ready to hand. The garden and the shop between them furnished the rarer half of the stillroom's materials, but a great part of the everyday physic of the house was built from the plainest things of all, the common stuff of the kitchen and the dairy that every household had ready to hand. Here again the old truth held that food and medicine were one substance seen from two sides. For the milk and the butter and the eggs, the owl and the vinegar, and the bread that fed the family in health became, with a little art, the medicine that tended it in sickness, and the lady moved between kitchen and stillroom in a single unbroken round of provision. The dairy alone gave a whole shelf of remedies. Fresh milk was a cooling and a nourishing thing, given to the fevered and the wasted, and whey, the thin part that ran off when milk was curdled, was a light and cooling drink much given in fevers and in the disorders of a hot summer. Cream soothed a chapped skin, and buttermilk cooled and cleared it, and butter itself, fresh and unsalted, was worked into 100 salves and ointments as the soft base that carried the healing herbs. There was a particular preparation much prized, the May butter, which was fresh butter set out in the sun through the sweet month of May and kept for the whole year after. Reckoned especially good for the making of ointments and the anointing of hurts, a small piece of spring stored up in a pot against the needs of the darker months. The egg was another everyday medicine, its yolk beaten into the caudles, and the possets to enrich and strengthen them, its white laid cool upon a burn or a sore eye, or beaten to a froth and used in the clearing of a syrup. A whole egg, lightly cooked, was among the gentlest of nourishments for a delicate stomach, and there was even an oil of eggs, drawn from the hard boiled yolks over a fire, kept for the anointing of chapped and cracked places. Bread had its uses too, soaked soft in milk and laid warm as a poultice to draw and to ease. Boiled to the smooth pap, called panada for the feeding of the very weak, and worked into the plasters as a body to hold the other things together. The buttery gave its all and its wine, and these were the great vehicles of the household's physic, the warm liquids in which so many remedies were given. Ale was the common drink and the common medicine both, warmed and spiced and sweetened for a cold, brewed sometimes with herbs and other things steeped in it to make the medicated aloes the old books describe, given as the plain carrier of many a bitter powder. Wine was stronger and dearer, and went into the cordials and the finer draughts, and the strong sweet sack was the heart of the best possets. Vinegar, the sharp child of soured wine or ale, had its own long list of uses, cooling a hot swelling, cleansing a foul sore, sharpening a gargle for a sore throat, and, held to the nose or sprinkled about a room, thought a real guard against the corrupt air of a time of sickness. Beside it stood verjuice, the sour green juice pressed from crab apples or unripe grapes, cooling and astringent, used in the kitchen and the sickroom alike. Even the plainest stores had their place. Salt made a gargle and a wash, and drew the water from an inflamed part. Oatmeal and barley made the gruels, and the barley water that fed and cooled the sick, and went also into soothing poultices. The rendered fats of the kitchen, the suet and the lard, were the bodies of the commonest salves. There was scarcely a thing in the whole domestic economy of the house that did not, on the right occasion, become a medicine, and the lady's knowledge reached across the whole of it, so that she could turn, at need, from the physic garden and the costly apothecary's drug to the milk pan and the bread crock, and find there, ready and cheap and always to hand, half of everything a sick body required. Let us turn now to one particular treasure of the household's own making, the gift of its own bees. Among the most valued of all the household's home-grown medicines was the produce of its own bees. and a manor of any size kept its hives, ranks of straw skeps set along a sheltered, flowery border. Tended with care and watched with real affection, for they gave two things the stillroom could hardly do without, the honey and the wax. The keeping of bees was itself half a mystery and half a craft, hedged about with old customs and beliefs, among them the tender practice, recorded across many regions, of telling the bees the important news of the household, a birth, a death, a marriage, murmured quietly at the hive, as though the creatures had a right to know the affairs of the people they served. Honey was the great sweetener of the older world, before ever sugar became common, and it never lost its place in the stillroom, even after sugar arrived, for it had virtues sugar could not match. It went into the syrups and the electuaries. It made the old and excellent mixture of honey and vinegar called oxymel, that was so much given for coughs and for the clearing of a thick chest, and it was the plain, soothing heart of 100 remedies for a sore throat and a troublesome cough, warmed with a little of some herb and given by the spoonful. Above all, honey was laid directly upon wounds and sores, spread over a hurt to keep it clean and to speed its closing, a use so old and so widespread that it long predated any understanding of why it answered, and one that the science of our own day has looked at again and found, quietly, to have been right all along, for honey does indeed help a wound against the things that would corrupt it. The wax was scarcely less useful than the honey. The beeswax, cleaned and melted, was the firm base of the salves and the ointments and the plasters, giving them body and helping them to keep and to hold to the skin, and it made the cerecloth, the waxed cloth laid over a hurt, and it sealed the pots and bottles of the store against the air. And it made, of course, the candles, the good clean burning candles of the better rooms, so that the very light by which the lady read her receipt book and tended her patient through the dark hours came, like so much else, from the labor of her own bees, the same small creatures furnishing at once the sweetness of her medicine and the light to give it by. From honey came also the household's own gentle wines, the mead that was fermented from honey and water, and the spiced and medicinal kind of mead called metheglin, brewed with a whole company of herbs and spices steeped into it, valued both as a pleasant drink and as a warming, cordial good for the chest and the spirits. The making of these honey wines was an art some houses took great pride in, and the receipts for them were traded and treasured like any other, so that one famous gentleman of the age, Sir Kenelm Digby, gathered up a great collection of the mead and metheglin receipts of many houses, which was printed after his death and shows us, in its long parade of spiced and herbed honey wines, how seriously and how variously this humblest of the household's wines was made. So the hive, quietly humming at the garden's edge through the long summer, gave the house its sweetness, its salve base, its candlelight, and its cordial wine all together, and earned, many times over, the affection and the careful tending its keepers gave it. Let us turn now to the other healers who worked about the manor and the parish, and to the lady's place among them. The lady of the manor was the first healer her household turned to, and very often the only one, but she was not the only healer to be had in the countryside. And part of her skill lay in knowing when a trouble was beyond her own art, and another's help must be sought. Around her, thinly spread across the country, worked a whole company of other healers, each with a particular skill, and she moved among them as the one who managed the health of her house, doing the great bulk of the work herself, and calling in the others for the graver and the more particular needs. Nearest to her own work stood the barber, surgeon, that practical man of the blade who did the things the lady did not, the letting of blood that the medicine of the age set such store by, the drawing of aching teeth, the lancing of the deep and stubborn sore, the dressing of the serious wound and the setting, sometimes, of the broken bone. When a member of the household needed bleeding, as the physic of the day so often held they did, it was commonly the barber, surgeon who was sent for to do it. And when a hurt was past the reach of the stillroom salves, his was the skill that answered. The lady and the barber, surgeon were partners in the health of the house, she keeping the daily physic, and he supplying the sharper and bloodier arts she did not practice. Beyond him were the more particular specialists, each often a local figure whose skill ran in a family and was famous for a day's ride around. The bone setter was called for the badly broken or the dislocated limb, a person of hereditary skill and strong hands who could set right what the household's comfrey and binding could only comfort. The midwife came for the births, as we have seen, the lady assisting and overseeing, but yielding to the older woman's practiced skill in the thing itself, and in the graver illnesses of the family. When the trouble was frightening and the means were there, the learned physician was sent for at last, riding out from the town with his degree and his fee and his authority, to give his opinion on a case the household could no longer manage alone. There were humbler and stranger healers too, at the edges of this world. The wise woman or the cunning man of the village kept, as they had for centuries, their herb, lore and their charms and their small magics, resorted to chiefly by the poorer folk for the troubles that neither the lady nor the physician answered, the lost goods and the ill wishes and the ailments that seemed to have no natural cause. With these the godly lady kept, for the most part, a careful distance, sharing something of their plain knowledge of the herbs, but holding back from the charms and the magic her religion taught her to distrust. And there were the travelling sellers of cures, who came through the fairs and markets with their bottles and their bold promises, trusted by some and laughed at by others, a colourful and dubious fringe upon the serious business of healing. Among all these the lady held her steady central place, the one constant healer of her household, the one always there, always known, always first resorted to, calling in the barber for a bleeding and the bone setter for a break and the physician for a mortal fever, but herself doing, day in and day out, the great unremarked bulk of the everyday healing that kept a great household on its feet. She was the hub of the whole small wheel of care, and her knowing of when to send for another was as much a part of her skill as any receipt in her book. Let us turn now to a part of her care we have not yet touched, the doctoring not of the people of the house, but of its animals. The health the lady watched over did not stop at the human members of the household, for a great estate depended upon its animals as much as upon its people, and the doctoring of the beasts was very much a part of the household's medicine, closely bound up with the physic of the family and often written down in the very same book. Turn the pages of a surviving receipt book, and you will find, among the waters for a fever, and the salves for a wound, the receipts for the ailments of the horse and the cow and the dog, set down in the same hand and drawn from the same store of herbs, for the line between the medicine of men and the medicine of beasts was, in that age, no sharper than the line between medicine and food. The horse stood first among the animals in worth and in care, for a good horse was a costly and a necessary thing, and its ailments were watched and answered with real attention. The old books are full of the cures for a horse, for its coughs and its lameness and its wounds, and the many troubles of a working beast, and the smith who shod it was often also its farrier and its doctor, working from a lore of horse, physic as old and as detailed as any. The cattle and the sheep and the swine had their own common sicknesses, the murrains and the rots and the fevers that could carry off a whole herd or flock and ruin a farming year, and against these the household tried what it could. The same herbs and the same practical care, given in larger measure to the larger beasts. Even the dogs of the hunt and the hawks of the mews had their medicine, falconry in particular carrying a whole delicate lore of the ailments of hawks and their remedies. The doing of this animal physic fell, in the main, not to the lady herself, but to the men who worked with the beasts, the steward and the farrier, and the shepherd and the huntsman. But the knowledge behind it very often flowed from her book and her stillroom, the same waters and salves and dried herbs serving the stable and the byre as served the nursery and the hall. A sick beast, like a sick servant, was a trouble to be met with the household's whole store of practical remedy, and the mingling of man, physic and beast, physic on the pages of the receipt books, is a plain and rather touching sign of how completely the medicine of the great house reached out to cover every living thing that depended on it, from the lord in his chamber to the horse in its stall. Let us turn now from the materials and the reach of the medicine to the exactness its making demanded, and to the weights and measures by which a remedy was kept safe. For all that so much of the stillroom's medicine was gentle and forgiving, a good part of it was not, and the safe making of a remedy often turned upon the exactness of its measuring. A little too much of a strong thing might do real harm, where the right amount did great good, and so the careful woman kept, among her tools, a small and accurate balance with its set of little weights, and she learned to use it and to respect it as one of the plainest safeguards of her whole craft. The knowing of when to be exact and when a rough measure would serve was itself a real part of her skill, learned like everything else at another woman's side. The measures she used came from two worlds that met upon her table. From the learned physic came the fine-graded weights of the apothecary, the grain and the scruple, and the dram and the ounce, each a fixed and known amount, set down in the careful receipts by their old symbols, so that a remedy calling for so many scruples of one thing and so many drams of another could be made the same and safe every time. And from the plainer world of the kitchen came the homelier measures, the handful and the pinch, the spoonful, the amount that would lie upon a coin, the quantity of a walnut or an egg, rougher reckonings that served well enough for the gentler herbs where no great harm could come of a little more or less. A good receipt used each where it belonged, exact weights for the strong and dangerous things, easy handfuls for the mild ones. The care was greatest with the strong medicines, and greatest of all with those that carried sleep and the easing of pain, for these were the ones a careless hand could turn from a mercy into a danger. The poppy, in its syrups and its stronger preparations, was the great giver of sleep and the great easer of pain that the age possessed, and it was given with a watchful care, in small and measured doses, and with a particular caution to children, for the very gift that made it precious made it perilous in too large a measure. The violent purges likewise, the strong roots and gums that emptied the body forcefully, were weighed and given with real attention, for their whole use lay in a careful dose that helped without harming. In all of this, the inherited proportions of the proved receipts were themselves a safeguard, a store of trials already made and dangers already learned, so that a woman following a receipt her mother had followed was walking, in a sense, in tested footsteps. She adjusted, too, for the patient before her, giving less to a child than to a grown person, less to the old and weak than to the strong, watching the effect of a first dose before she gave a second, tasting and judging as she went. This was not a mechanical art, but a watchful and a responsible one, carried always with the quiet knowledge that a body had been put into her hands, and that the same skill which could ease and cure could, mishandled, do the opposite. The best of these women carried that responsibility soberly, and it shows in the caution of their receipts and the care of their practice, a seriousness that gives the lie to any notion of their physic as a careless dabbling. Let us turn now to the most dangerous things of all that a stillroom might hold, the poisons that were kept apart and under lock. Every well-furnished stillroom held, somewhere among its stores, a few things that were frankly dangerous, poisons in any, but the smallest and most careful use, and these were kept apart from the rest, marked and locked away, out of the reach of a curious child or an ignorant hand. For the knowledge of the poisons was, in that age as in ours, simply a part of the knowledge of medicine, since so many of the strongest remedies were poisons tamed, deadly in one amount and healing in another, and the woman who understood her craft understood its dangerous edge as clearly as its gentle heart. The plants of this dangerous shelf were the famous poisons of the countryside and the physic garden alike. There was the henbane, drowsy and dangerous, used with great care to bring sleep and to still a raging pain, and the hemlock, deadliest of the hedgerow plants, used mostly from without, laid in plasters upon a hot swelling or a maddening pain, rather than ever given by the mouth. There was the deadly nightshade with its shining berries, and the monkshood, and the white hellebore, and the strange mandrake of ancient fame, and the poppy that we have already met, and from the apothecary came the mineral poisons stronger and stranger still, the quicksilver and the rest, kept for particular and desperate users, and handled with the greatest caution of all. Some of these went into the old sleeping preparations, by which a grievous pain might be dulled, the drowsy draughts and the soporific sponges that the medicine of the age reached for when nothing gentler would serve, given always with a careful and a fearful hand. The keeping of these things was a grave responsibility, and the good housewife kept them accordingly, in a locked place, plainly marked, never among the ordinary stores where a mistake might be made in the dark or by a tired hand. She taught the household, too, to know the dangerous plants that grew about them. The children shown early which berries and which leaves meant death, exactly as the cottage mother taught her own. for a great house, with its gardens and its hedges, held as many perils for a heedless child as any cottage did. The old saying that it is the dose that makes the poison, which the physicians of the age were beginning to set down plainly, was a truth the practical woman had always known in her hands, and her whole careful handling of these dangerous stores was that truth made into daily habit, a steady respect for the thin and shifting line between the medicine that heals and the same substance that kills. Let us turn now from the curing of sickness to the gentler and wiser art of keeping it away, and to all the lady did to hold her household in health before ever a remedy was needed. The wisest physic of all, the old books agreed, was the physic that kept a body well, so that it never fell sick at all. And a great part of the lady's care went not into the curing of illness, but into the quiet, daily art of preventing it. She was, in this, the guardian of the whole household's way of living, watching over the things that the medicine of the age held to govern health, and steering her people as far as she could along the temperate middle path that was thought to keep sickness at bay. The old teaching named a handful of things that a body's health depended on, the things that were not born in the body, but came to it from without and could be ordered for good or ill. There was the air one breathed, which was why the sweetening of rooms and the avoiding of foul and stagnant places mattered so much. There was the food and the drink one took, in which moderation was everything, and the balance of hot and cold and moist and dry foods matched to the season and the constitution. There was sleep and waking, which were to be kept in due measure, and exercise and rest, neither too much nor too little of either, and the regular emptying of the body of its wastes, and finally the passions of the mind, the angers and griefs and fears that were held, and not wrongly, to make a body sick as surely as any bad air or bad meat. Over all of these the lady kept a watchful, governing eye. Much of this preventive care followed the turning of the year. It was the common practice of the age to cleanse the body in the spring, to clear away the thick and heavy humours thought to gather over a long winter of salt meat and close rooms, with gentle purges and cooling spring herbs and the first green things of the year, so that a household came out of winter lightened and refreshed. In the heat of summer the diet turned cooling to the cucumbers and the lettuces and the sharp cooling fruits and the barley waters, and in the cold of winter it turned warming again to the spices and the strong broths and the warming cordials. The lady ordered her table and her stillroom by this turning wheel, giving each season the food and the physic its nature was thought to require. She gave counsel, too, of the plainer and more timeless kind, the counsel that any age would know for wisdom. She urged moderation at the table, for the age understood very well that a great part of the diseases of the comfortable came straight from their own excess, the gout and the stone and the heavy sluggish sicknesses of too much rich meat and strong wine. She valued good sleep and fresh air and honest exercise, and she knew, as the old teaching had always insisted, that a troubled mind bred a sick body, that grief and rage and long anxiety could waste a person as surely as any fever, and so the keeping of a calm and a cheerful and a well-ordered household was itself, in her understanding, a kind of medicine, a guarding of the health of everyone in it. In all of this her physic and her whole management of the house ran together, for to keep a house well fed and well aired and well rested, and at peace was to keep it healthy, and that keeping was her charge, from one end of the year to the other. Let us turn now to the way she reckoned the seasons and the days themselves, and to the almanac and the moon by which so much of her timing was set. The old Physic was a physic of timing as much as of substance, and the careful woman gave heed not only to what she gathered and gave, but to when, choosing her seasons and even her days by a reckoning that tied her small stillroom to the great turning of the heavens above it. On her shelf, beside the herbal and the receipt book, there very often lay an almanac, one of the cheap printed yearly books that poured from the presses in great numbers, and it was among the most consulted books she owned. The almanac gave her the calendar of the year, the feasts and the seasons, but it gave her much more besides. It set down the phases of the moon, which mattered to her gathering, for the old wisdom held, as it had always held among the cottage healers too, that the leaves and flowers were best taken as the moon waxed and the roots as it wined, the plant's virtue rising and falling with the tide of the moon's light. It marked the days thought good or ill for the letting of blood and the taking of purges and the weaning of children and much else, and it carried, in a great many editions, the curious old figure called the Zodiac Man, a picture of a human body ringed by the 12 signs, each sign set against the part of the body it was held to govern, so that a reader could see at a glance which sign ruled the head, and which the heart, and which the feet, and time her physic accordingly. Behind all this lay the old belief, serious and widely held, that the planets and the signs of the heavens governed the herbs of the earth and the parts of the body alike, so that a herb ruled by one planet was fitted to heal the illnesses of the part that same planet governed. It was a whole system of correspondences binding the plant, the star, and the body into one great ordered scheme, and it was set down in full in the popular herbals of the day, most famously in the astrological herbal of Culpeper, who gave every plant its ruling planet and reasoned its virtues from the stars. Whether the stars truly govern the herbs, we need not trouble to decide tonight. And the women who followed the scheme seem to have held it lightly enough alongside their plain practical knowledge, but it gave their whole craft a shape and an order, tying the humble work of the stillroom to the vast, slow wheeling of the sky, and lending to the gathering of a common herb, on the right day, a quiet sense of rightness, and of participation in a larger order of things. Let us turn now to the last of the things that travelled with the medicine, the words that were spoken over it and with it. The medicine of that age was rarely given in silence, for words went with it as naturally as the spoon that carried it, and among the women of the manor those words were, for the most part, the words of prayer. When a lady gave a remedy to a sick child or a failing servant, she gave it in the plain expectation that its working lay finally in the hands of God, that the herb was only the means, and the blessing was His. And so her physic was wrapped about with prayer at every turn, a prayer said over the making, a prayer said at the giving, a thankfulness offered when the sickness lifted. The godly gentlewomen, whose diaries survive, show us this again and again, the tending of the body and the tending of the soul set down in the same breath, the same hand that mixed the cordial folding a moment later in prayer beside the bed. This was, for the earnest Protestant women who kept these houses, the proper and the sanctioned way of joining words to medicine, the trusting of the outcome to God, while using faithfully the means he had provided in the herbs of the field. It sat easily with their whole understanding of the world, in which sickness might be a trial sent for a purpose, and healing a mercy to be prayed for and received with thanks. And it made of their physic something more than a mere handling of herbs, a work of charity and of faith together, body and soul tended, as the one creature they believed them to be. At the edges of this prayerful practice lingered an older and a stranger tradition, the tradition of the charm. The set words and the written papers and the muttered blessings that the cunning folk of the villages still used, and that reached back into a far older world of spoken power over sickness. The godly lady of the manor kept her distance, for the most part, from this older magic, which her religion taught her to distrust as superstition or worse, and which belonged more to the wise woman in her cottage than to the great house. Yet the border was never perfectly clean, and here and there a receipt book preserves, among its prayers and its herbs, a charm or a set of strange words to be said over a hurt, a small survival of the older way tucked in among the newer, evidence that the line between the sanctioned prayer and the suspect charm ran, in practice, less sharply than the preachers might have wished. Whatever the words were, prayer or blessing or charm, they did a real work that we should not be too quick to dismiss, the work of comfort, in an age when so much of illness could not be cured, and when the causes of sickness were dark and frightening. The speaking of familiar and hopeful words over a suffering body steadied both the one who spoke and the one who suffered, gave shape and meaning to a frightening hour, and carried into the sickroom a sense that something more than herbs was at work on the patient's side. This was medicine of a kind, medicine for the fear that goes with sickness, and the wise healer knew its value and never withheld it. The whole person was tended, the frightened mind along with the failing body, and the words that went with the remedy were as much a part of the giving as the remedy itself. Sometimes the words were not spoken only but written, folded small and worn, and a handful of these written charms survived to us, tucked away inside the bindings of old books or sewn into the linings of preserved garments, most of them meant to guard against a fever, or to ease a hard childbirth, or to quiet the falling sickness. The words upon them ranged from plain prayers and verses of scripture to strings of holy names, the names of the three kings said to guard against fits, or old arrangements of letters whose meaning had been half forgotten even by those who copied them. To the strictest of the godly, these papers were a suspect thing, too near the old magic to be quite comfortable, and yet they went on being made and worn, quietly, at the edges of respectable practice. One more sign of how deep the wish went to set some words, any words, between a loved body and the dark thing that threatened it. It is worth pausing on how natural and how human all this was. Picture only a mother sitting through the night beside a feverish child, spooning a warm cordial between its lips and murmuring over it. Again and again, the same few words of a familiar prayer. We need not decide whether the words changed anything in the child's body to see plainly what they did for the room, steadying the mother's own frightened hands, filling the long dark hours with something to hold to, wrapping the sick child in the sound of a voice it knew and trusted. That was a real comfort, given freely. at the very hours when comfort was most needed and cure most uncertain, and to leave it out of any honest account of the medicine of that age would be to miss a great part of what the medicine actually was. So the medicine of the manor was never a bare matter of herbs and weights alone. It was herbs and weights, and timing by the season and the moon, and words of prayer or blessing, and the whole patient tenderness of the sickroom, all woven together into a single art that reached from the body to the soul, and from the garden bed to the wheeling stars. Beyond the herbs and the words, and the reckoning of days, though, stood one more thing that shaped the lady's craft, the growing store of printed books that met her own handwritten one upon the shelf. And to those books, and to the learning some of these women reached, we turn now. Beside the handwritten book that governed the still room there stood, on the shelf of a well-furnished house, a growing number of printed books, for the age of our story was the great age in which the physic of the herbal and the household passed into print and spread, cheaply and widely, as it never had before. The lady drew on these printed books as freely as on her own manuscript, and the two kinds of book fed one another, she copying a good receipt from a printed page into her own book, and the printers in their turn gathering up the receipts of gentlewomen and setting them in type for others to copy back into manuscripts of their own. The grandest of the printed books were the great herbals, the heavy illustrated volumes that named and pictured the plants and set down their virtues. John Gerard's Herbal, first printed in the last years of the old Queen, was the most famous of them in England, its woodcuts and its confident descriptions consulted in many a country house. And after it came the still greater works of John Parkinson, whose garden book and whose vast herbal gathered up the whole plant knowledge of the day. These were reference books to be turned to when a plant was in doubt or its users forgotten, and a lady fortunate enough to have one had at her elbow a whole library of the learned plant lore of the age. But the books that touched her daily work most nearly were the humbler ones, the manuals of housewifery and physic written for exactly her station and her needs. Gervase Markham's book on the complete Englishwoman, which we have met already, set out the whole duty of a housewife, including her physic and her cookery, and was reprinted again and again. Later came the printed collections of receipts that carried the very form of her own manuscript into type. Books with names like The Queen's Closet Opened, which claim to reveal the very receipts used by the Queen and her ladies, and the choice manual of the Countess of Kent, and the several books that went out under the name of Hannah Woolley, herself a woman who had served in great households and who set down for a wide readership the whole art of the stillroom and the sickroom she had learned there. These books sold well and were much used, for they gave to any literate woman the accumulated domestic physic that had once passed only from mother to daughter and friend to friend. One printed book of the age deserves a particular word, for it changed the reach of physic more than any other, and that was the English Physician of Nicholas Culpeper, who did a bold and much resented thing in putting the knowledge of the physicians into plain English and cheap print, so that the ordinary householder could know the virtues of the herbs and treat herself and her family without the costly help of a learned doctor. The physicians of the day disliked him greatly for it, but the common people and the country gentlewomen took his book to their hearts, and it went through edition after edition and stood on a great many still-room shelves, its plain English lists of herbs and cures thumbed and stained with use. Through such a book the learned medicine and the household medicine drew closer than ever they had been, and the woman at her still could reason a little in the physician's own terms. Not all of these women were merely practical copyists of other people's receipts. Some among them were genuinely learned, reading widely, thinking carefully, and keeping records of their own practice that stand comparison with any physician's. The greatest of these whose papers survive was Grace Mildmay, the gentlewoman we have already met, who across a long life set down not only her receipts but her observations of the cases she treated, her reasoning about them, and her whole careful method, filling many pages in a hand that shows a mind as serious and as systematic as any of the age. To read of her work is to be reminded that the domestic physic of these women was not always a matter of rule of thumb and inherited habit, but could rise, in the ablest of them, to something very like a true and studied medicine, pursued with rigor across a whole lifetime. Yet a wall stood across the path of every such woman, however able, and it is right to name it plainly. The universities were closed to her, and so was the College of Physicians and every formal degree and license that the learned medicine reserved to men. She might read as widely as any doctor, keep better notes, and cure as surely, but she could never be called a physician, nor practice openly for a fee, nor claim the standing that her knowledge, in a man, would have earned. Her medicine was permitted, and even praised, so long as it kept to its proper sphere, the household and the charitable care of the poor, and did not presume to the professional ground the men had fenced about. Within that sphere she was free, and honored, and useful beyond measure. Beyond it she could not go, whatever her gifts, and a great deal of real ability spent itself, of necessity, within the walls of the stillroom and the sickroom, unrecorded and unrewarded by the wider world. Let us turn now, before we take our leave of this quiet world, to a question worth pausing over. The plain question of how much of all this old physic was actually any good. It is easy, from the comfort of a later and better understood age, to smile at the medicine of the stillroom, at its humours and its gathering by the moon, its gold in the cordials and its charms tucked among the prayers, and to imagine that little of it can have done any real good at all. But that would be to judge it too quickly and too harshly, for a great deal of what these women did had genuine sense in it, and some of it has been vindicated in our own time in ways the women themselves could never have foreseen. The truth is a mixed one, as truths generally are, and it is worth telling calmly and fairly, neither mocking the old physic nor pretending it was all quiet wisdom. Consider first their guiding principle, the plain habit of writing proved beside a remedy that had been tried and found to answer. In that single word lay something very like the beginning of a science, the testing of a thing against experience, and the keeping of what worked. And across the long generations of a family's book, that patient winnowing had a real power, sifting slowly toward the remedies that helped and away from those that did not. It was not the controlled and measured proving of a modern laboratory, and it was clouded by all the errors of its age, but it was a genuine and a serious empiricism, and it is one reason so many of the remedies that survived the sifting turn out on inspection, to have had something in them after all, and a striking number of them did. The honey they laid so freely on wounds we now know to be genuinely hostile to the things that corrupt a wound, so that their oldest and simplest dressing was also one of their soundest. The willow bark they steeped for pain and fever, and the meadow sweet they gathered from the wet meadows for the same, both carry within them the natural kin of the substance from which a very common modern pain remedy was in time derived, so that a country woman easing an ache with a bitter willow tea was reaching, without knowing it, toward a real and lasting medicine. The garlic and the onion they crushed onto sores and swallowed against infection do indeed carry a power against the small living things that cause disease. Even the mouldy bread that some laid upon a wound, mocked for centuries as the very picture of ignorant filth, sits uncomfortably close to the mode from which a great healing discovery of the modern age was later drawn. In our own time, the curiosity of scholars has carried a few of these old remedies out of the receipt books and into the laboratory to be tested properly at last, and the results have sometimes given even the testers pause. The most talked of these was an eye salve from a very old English book of leechcraft, a simple mixture of garlic and onion, wine, and the bile of an ox, left to stand together in a brass vessel for a set number of nights, exactly as the old receipt directed. When a team of modern researchers made it up faithfully in the year 2015 and set it against one of the stubborn, resistant bacteria that trouble the medicine of today, the old salve, to their considerable surprise, did real harm to the very germs that so much modern effort struggles against. It is told here only as history, and as a small caution against dismissing the old knowledge too easily. But it is a striking thing all the same, that a remedy set down more than 1,000 years ago, made faithfully to its ancient receipt, should still have virtue enough to interest the careful science of our own day. We should not swing too far the other way, for a great deal of the old physic was useless, and some of it was worse than useless. The bleeding they trusted so completely more often weakened than helped. The gold and the pearl in the cordials did nothing but comfort the mind of the one who swallowed them. The whole grand scheme of the humours, on which so much of the reasoning rested, was simply mistaken about the workings of the body, and led them again and again to do the wrong thing for the right reason. The fair judgment is a balanced one. These women were neither the ignorant dabblers a later age dismissed, nor the secret possessors of a lost perfect wisdom that a more romantic view would make them. They were practical, careful, observant people, working with the knowledge they had, getting a good deal right and a good deal wrong, and handing down, across the centuries, a body of experience that held real treasure mixed in with its errors, and that deserves, on the whole, a good deal more respect than it was given for a very long time. Let us turn now, as our long evening truly begins to draw toward its close, to the slow fading of this whole quiet world, and to what became of it in the end. Nothing in this world lasts unchanged, and the world of the stillroom and the receipt book, for all its long endurance, faded at last slowly, and without any single moment of ending, across the later years of our story and the century that followed. Several changes together wore it away. The learned medicine grew nearer and cheaper and more trusted, with more physicians and more apothecaries, and, in time, the shops full of ready-made medicines that a household could simply buy, so that the reasons that had once made the lady's own physic a plain necessity slackened one by one. Why distill a water through a long summer's day when a bottle of something could be bought in the town? Why keep the whole difficult art alive when the need that had sustained it was passing? As the medicine slipped away, the book that had held it changed its nature. The receipt book that had once mingled physic and cookery in equal measure narrowed, generation by generation, toward the cookery alone, the medical receipts dropping out of it as they dropped out of use, until the household book that a great-grandmother had kept as a book of healing came down to a great-granddaughter as a book of puddings and preserves, its old physic forgotten or struck through or simply left uncopied. The stillroom itself outlasted its stills, becoming a room for the keeping of preserves and the making of tea and the storing of the good china, its copper alembics sold for scrap or pushed into a corner, its very name surviving into a later age, detached at last from the still that had given it, a word whose meaning few who used it any longer knew. The old theory that had held the whole edifice together, the ancient balance of the humours, gave way in time to newer understandings of the body, and the physic built upon it came to seem quaint and old-fashioned, a thing of grandmothers and of country ignorance, to be smiled at by an age that thought itself wiser. And so the whole great tradition of women's household medicine, that had kept so many people alive and eased so many deaths across so many centuries, passed quietly out of use and very nearly out of memory, remembered, when it was remembered at all, as a charming domestic hobby, rather than as the serious and necessary art it had truly been. And yet it did not vanish altogether, and it is worth saying, as we come to the close, what survives of it still. The manuscripts survive, the actual receipt books of actual women, resting now in the great libraries and the family collections and the museum cases, their brown pages still legible, still crowded with the remedies and the hands of the women who kept them, waiting for anyone who cares to read them and hear, across the centuries, those quiet, practical voices. The printed books survive, the herbals and the housewife's manuals, reprinted and studied and loved anew. And the knowledge itself survives in part, for scholars in our own day have gone back to these books with fresh respect and found, again and again, that much of what these women did had real sense in it, that their honey did indeed help a wound to heal, that their willow bark did indeed ease a pain, that a great deal of what was long dismissed as old wives' medicine was closer to the truth than the age that dismissed it ever guessed. The old wives, it turns out, were often right, and the patient, generous, unregarded knowledge they kept and shared and handed down was a real treasure after all, and is coming slowly to be honoured again as one. And so we come to the end of our long evening in the manor house, and it is time to let all of it settle gently into the dark. We have wandered a great while tonight through the hidden medicine of the great house, from the lady who was its physician and the book she kept in her mother's hand, through the letters that carried remedies between the houses and the quiet room where they were made, the distilled waters and the cordial cupboard, the sweet preserves and the healing salves, the tending of the whole household from the scullery boy to the lord, the childbed and the nursery, the poor at the gate, the books upon the shelf and the goods from far away, all the way down to the slow fading of the whole gentle craft and its quiet honoring again in our own day. It has been a long journey, and there is nothing at all left in it now that asks anything of you. There is nothing to remember and nothing to do. The still is cold, the shelves are full and in good order. The book is closed and put away in its chest, with the day's last receipt freshly written in it. Somewhere in the great quiet house a single candle burns low in the stillroom window, and the whole slow world we have imagined tonight, the herbs drying in the loft, the waters clear in their bottles, the sweet bags laid among the linen, has gone still and dark around it. Let it settle now, and let yourself settle with it, down into the same soft and gathering dark. Sleep well. The quiet apothecary will be back soon with another quiet chapter. For now there is only the low steady dark, the last of the candlelight fading gently to nothing, and the whole of a long, untroubled night stretching out before you, unhurried, uninterrupted, and entirely your own.